wall stands 700 feet above a frozen world, and two riders approach it from the south. One is old, his white cloak stained with the mud of 12 kingdoms. The other is young, with dark hair and darker eyes, and a sword on his hip that has already tasted blood. They have ridden through a war and come out the other side with 200 men at their backs and grief that neither of them speaks about. The dead are walking beyond that wall. And these two men, master and student, father and son in every way that matters, are riding toward them. They saw the wall from 30 miles away. It rose above the tree line like a second horizon, a cliff of ice so vast it seemed less like something men had built and more like something the world had grown on its own, the way mountains grow, slowly and without permission. The closer they rode, the larger it became, until it filled the northern sky from east to west, and the men behind Jon stopped talking altogether. Barristan reined up beside him. His breath came in clouds. The cold had settled into his joints 3 days ago and hadn't left. A dull ache in his sword hand that he'd told no one about. "I fought at the Battle of the Bells," Barristan said quietly. "I've stood on the walls of King's Landing during the defiance of Duskendale. I watched the towers of Meereen from across a desert." He paused, staring up at the wall. "I have never seen anything like that." "No one has," Jon said. "No one who rides south of it. Anyway, they reached Castle Black at dusk." Jon had heard stories about the Night's Watch his entire life. His uncle Benjen had served here, had spoken of the Brotherhood with a quiet pride that made it sound like something worth wanting. Jon had imagined discipline, order, men who understood duty the way Barristan understood it, not because someone made them, but because they'd chosen it. What he found was a ruin. The gates of Castle Black hung open, and no one challenged them as they rode through. The yard was half mud, half ice. A stable had partially collapsed, and no one had cleared the debris. 3 men sat around a fire near the armory, passing a skin of something that wasn't water, and they looked up at 200 armed horsemen riding into their castle with the dull surprise of men who had stopped expecting anything at all. "Who commands here?" Jon called out. The 3 men looked at each other. One of them stood, wiping his mouth. "Sir Alliser Thorne is acting commander," the man said. "Lord Commander Mormont is dead." Jon felt the words land somewhere in his chest. Jor Mormont. His uncle Benjen's commander. The Old Bear, they'd called him, and Jon had been told stories about the man's steady hand since he was a boy at Winterfell. "Dead how?" Jon asked. "Mutiny at a place called Craster's Keep, north of the wall. Some of the brothers turned on him. Killed him. And a dozen others." The man's eyes moved across the column of armed men behind Jon. "Are you from the king?" "I'm Jon Snow, son of Eddard Stark, sent by Robb Stark, king in the north." He paused, because the next words felt strange to say. "We're here to help." They found Alliser Thorne in the Lord Commander's quarters, which he'd moved into with the particular speed of a man who'd been waiting for the opportunity. He was tall and lean, and hard in the way of men who confused cruelty with strength. Jon knew the type. He'd met them in King's Landing, in Lannister armor. Thorne looked at Jon the way a man looks at a stain on his table. "A bastard," Thorne said. "Stark sends a bastard to save the Night's Watch." "Stark sends 200 men," Barristan said from behind Jon. His voice was quiet, the way it got when he was very close to hitting someone. "Armed, provisioned, and ready to fight. Shall we discuss that? Or shall we discuss the circumstances of this man's birth?" Thorne's eyes moved to Barristan, and something in them changed. Recognition. Maybe, even at the end of the world, men knew the name Barristan Selmy. "You're a long way from the Kingsguard, old man. I'm exactly where I need to be." Barristan didn't blink. "As are these soldiers. Your wall is undermanned and poorly provisioned. Your Lord Commander is dead by his own brother's hands. And from what we've heard, the enemy you're meant to be watching for has already come. So I suggest you accept the help." Thorne accepted. Not gracefully, not willingly, but he accepted, because even he could count. The Night's Watch had fewer than 600 men spread across 3 castles. 200 trained soldiers nearly doubled the fighting strength of Castle Black alone. Jon's men set up camp in the abandoned portions of the castle. Castle Black had been built for thousands and now held barely 200 brothers. There were entire wings that hadn't seen a fire in years, hallways where the ice had crept in through cracks in the walls and frozen into strange shapes that caught the torchlight. In one corridor, the ice had formed a column that reached from floor to ceiling, and the torchlight passed through it and threw blue shadows on the opposite wall. In another, a ceiling had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated frost, and the rubble lay where it had fallen, dusted with snow that had blown through the gap. Jon walked through them that first night, Ghost padding beside him, and felt the emptiness of the place like a physical weight. This was what the Night's Watch had become. Not the proud brotherhood of his uncle's stories, not the shield that guards the realms of men. A crumbling ruin at the edge of the world, manned by criminals and outcasts, and the occasional true believer, held together by tradition and stubbornness, and nothing else. The wall itself was magnificent, but the men who served it were dying. And the fortress they inhabited was dying with them. He found Samwell Tarly in the library. Sam was everything Jon didn't expect. Soft and round and frightened of his own shadow, with the kind of voice that apologized for existing. But his eyes were quick, and when he started talking, it became clear that whatever this man lacked in courage he made up for in something that might matter more. "I killed one," Sam said. Jon stared at him. "You killed a White Walker. With dragonglass. Obsidian, I found a cache of it at the Fist of the First Men, buried in an old Night's Watch cloak. Arrowheads, daggers, a few spearheads. When the walker came for us, I stabbed it, and it shattered." Sam's hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "They're not invincible, my lord. They can be killed. We just need the right weapons. Show me the dragonglass." Sam took him to a storeroom where the obsidian pieces were laid out on a table, black glass that caught the candlelight with an oily sheen. There wasn't much. Enough for perhaps 30 weapons. Against an army of the dead, it was nothing. "Is there more?" Jon asked. "Dragonstone," Sam said immediately. "The old Targaryen fortress. It sits on a mountain of obsidian. If someone could get there, they could mine enough dragonglass to arm every man on the wall." Jon filed that away. Dragonstone was in the south, held by Stannis Baratheon's Castellan. A problem for another day. "Tell me about the dead," Jon said. Sam told him. The ranging to the Fist of the First Men, the army of whites that had come out of the dark like a tide of rotting flesh. How the dead had risen from the ground, men who'd been brothers an hour before, standing up with blue eyes and murder in their hands. How the Watch had broken and run and kept running. "How many?" Jon asked. "I don't know. Thousands, tens of thousands. They were still coming when we fled." Sam swallowed. "And there are the wildlings. Mance Rayder has gathered every free folk tribe beyond the wall. 100,000 of them, maybe more. They're marching south, marching on the wall, marching away from the dead. That changed everything." Jon found Barristan in the armory, oiling his sword by firelight. The old knight's movements were precise, automatic. The kind of habit that survived when everything else fell away. Jon had watched him do this every night for 9 years. "The wildlings aren't invading," Jon said. "They're running." Barristan looked up. His eyes were sharp in the firelight, and Jon could see the calculation happening behind them. 67 years of warfare reduced to a single question. Running from what? An army of the dead, thousands of them, maybe more. They're being driven south, and the wall is the only thing between them and whatever is chasing them. Barristan set down his cloth. "Then we have 2 enemies on the same side of the wall, and we're standing between them." "No," Jon said. "We have one enemy. The dead. The wildlings are just people trying to survive." Barristan studied him for a long moment. "That's a dangerous thought, Jon. It's the truth. I didn't say it wasn't. I said it was dangerous. There isn't a man on this wall who'll want to hear it. They've been fighting wildlings for 1,000 years. You're asking them to see those people differently in the span of a single conversation. I'm not asking them to see anything. I'm telling you what's real. Jon sat down across from his mentor. If the dead come, and there are 100,000 wildlings between us and them, those wildlings die. And then they stand back up as soldiers for the other side. Every man, woman, and child becomes a weapon aimed at us. The silence stretched between them. Barristan picked up his cloth again, ran it along the blade. You sound like a commander, Barristan said. I sound like a man who can count. Same thing, sometimes. Barristan sheathed the sword. What do you want to do? I want to go see for myself. Take a ranging party north. Find out what we're dealing with. How many dead, how they move, where the walkers are. And I want to find Mance Rayder. You want to treat with him. I want to talk to him. There's a difference. Barristan stood, and Jon heard his knees crack in the cold. The old knight had not complained once in 3 weeks of riding through winter, but the wall was something else entirely. The cold here wasn't weather. It was architecture. It lived in the stones and the ice and the air itself, and it went through wool and fur and leather as if they were silk. When do we leave? Barristan asked. You don't have to come. We've had this conversation before. Multiple times, as I recall. You lose it every time. Jon almost smiled. Dawn, then I'll take 20 men. 30, Barristan said. And Sam, if these things can be killed with dragonglass, I want the man who discovered that close at hand. Thorne refused to authorize the ranging. He stood in the Lord Commander's solar, behind a desk that didn't belong to him, and told Jon that no ranging parties would leave Castle Black without his express permission. That the wall's defense took priority over reconnaissance, and that if Jon Snow wanted to play at soldiering, he could do it south of the wall, where bastards belonged. Jon listened to all of it. He let Thorne finish, the way Barristan had taught him. Let a man empty his quiver. When every arrow is spent, all that's left is the man holding the bow. How many brothers have you lost to the dead? Jon asked. Thorne's jaw tightened. That's not your concern. How many? 43 at the Fist, another 11 at Craster's Keep, not counting the Lord Commander. 54 men, and you don't know what killed them, how it moves, how fast it travels, or when it's coming here. Jon kept his voice even. You're guarding a wall 700 feet high and 100 leagues long with 600 men, and you don't know what's on the other side of it. That's not defense. That's blindness. Thorne's hand moved to his sword, then stopped. 200 armed men loyal to Jon Snow were camped in his courtyard. The mathematics of authority had changed. If you ride north and die, Stark will blame the Watch. If I ride north and die, you'll have 200 men who need a new commander. That seems like something you'd want. Jon turned for the door. We leave at dawn. They rode through the tunnel beneath the wall at first light. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, and the ice pressed in from every side. The sound of hooves echoed strangely, bouncing off frozen walls that wept in the faint warmth of the torches. The ice was ancient here, compressed by centuries of weight into something that was almost blue, almost transparent. And in the torchlight, Jon could see shapes frozen deep within it. Air bubbles, maybe, or something else. Something that had been trapped when the wall was built and had stayed trapped ever since. It took nearly 10 minutes to ride through, and when they emerged on the other side, the world changed. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 feet. Jon felt it like a physical blow, the cold wrapping around him, pressing against his skin, finding every gap in his armor and every seam in his clothing. The horses felt it too. They shied and stamped, their breath coming in thick clouds, their ears pinned back against the unfamiliar bite of air that carried no warmth at all. The haunted forest stretched north in every direction. Ancient trees draped in snow, their branches interlocking overhead like the ribs of some enormous dead animal. Ironwood and sentinel trees, their trunks black against the white ground, standing so close together that the forest floor lay in permanent shadow. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing moved. Ghost ranged ahead, a white shape against a white world, visible only by the red of his eyes. The direwolf moved through the snow without sound, his massive paws barely leaving prints, and Jon watched him and felt something ancient stir in his blood. A connection between wolf and master that went deeper than training, deeper than loyalty, down to something primal and wordless that belonged to the old gods and the old magic and the North itself. Barristan rode up beside Jon and said nothing for a long time. "It's wrong," Barristan finally said. Jon looked at him. The silence. "I've ridden through forests in the Reach, the Riverlands, the Stormlands. There's always something. Birds, insects, animals in the undergrowth. This place is..." He searched for the word. "Empty, as if everything alive has already left. Or died," Sam said from behind them, and then looked mortified at having spoken. They rode north for 2 days. The forest gave way to rolling hills of white, and the hills gave way to frozen plains, and the temperature dropped so steadily that by the second morning, Jon's water skin had frozen solid in its leather pouch. Barristan wrapped his sword hand in layers of cloth and flexed his fingers constantly, keeping the blood moving, keeping the joints from stiffening. Jon watched him do it and said nothing. On the second night, they found the village. It had been a wildling settlement, maybe 50 huts arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. The fire had gone out long ago. The huts were empty, their hide doors hanging open like mouths caught mid-scream. "Search it," Jon told his men. "Pairs. Stay within sight of each other." They searched. Every hut was the same. Belongings scattered, food left half-eaten, furs thrown aside as if the people wearing them had simply stood up and walked away. No blood. No bodies. No sign of a fight. "They fled," Barristan said, crouching by the cold fire pit. But not in a panic. This was orderly. They gathered their weapons, their children, and they left. "Left where?" Jon asked. The answer came at midnight. Jon was standing watch when he heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of sound, a deepening of the silence that had followed them since they'd crossed the wall. As if the air itself was holding its breath. Then the ground moved. Not an earthquake, something worse. The frozen earth in the center of the village buckled upward, and a hand pushed through. Then another. Then a face, grey and rotting, with eyes that burned a blue so bright they cast shadows. "Up!" Jon shouted. "Everyone up! They're coming out of the ground." The dead rose. They came from beneath the huts, beneath the fire pit, beneath the snow. Men and women and children who had once lived in this village, buried shallow or not buried at all, their flesh preserved by the cold and their eyes lit with that terrible blue light. They moved in silence, which was the worst part. No war cries, no screaming, no sounds of effort, just the crunch of frozen earth and the soft scrape of dead fingers on stone. Jon drew Longclaw and felt the Valyrian steel hum in his hand. The first wight came at him from the left, a man twice his size with a woodcutter's axe still frozen to his hand. Jon took the axe arm at the elbow and drove Longclaw through the thing's chest in a single motion. The wight staggered, but didn't fall. It reached for him with its remaining hand, and Jon took its head. That worked. "Take their heads." Jon shouted, "Fire! Get the fires lit." Barristan was already fighting. Even in the dark, even at 67, the old knight moved with a precision that made the younger men look like they were wading through mud. His sword described clean arcs in the torchlight, and wights fell around him like wheat before a scythe. But they kept getting up. They don't die. One of Jon's soldiers screamed, "Fire!" Barristan called back, "Burn them! A sword alone won't hold them." Sam stumbled forward with a torch and thrust it into the nearest wight. The thing caught like dry timber, flames racing across its frozen flesh, and it went down and stayed down, burning on the snow. The fight lasted 15 minutes. It felt like a year. Jon killed 6 of them. He knew the number because he counted afterward the way Barristan had taught him to count after every engagement. 3 men, 2 women, and something that might have been a child. Though it was so badly decomposed, he couldn't be certain. The child was the worst. It came at him with small grey hands outstretched, reaching not with weapons but with fingers, and Jon took its head and felt something inside him go quiet and stay quiet. Barristan killed more. Jon didn't know the exact number because the old knight had fought on the opposite side of the village, but when the fires burned down, there were 11 bodies around the place where Barristan had made his stand. 11 whites, dismembered and burning, arranged in a rough semicircle around a trampled patch of snow, where one man had held his ground against everything the dead had thrown at him. They lost 4 men. Harren, a northern soldier who'd been with Jon since Riverrun, was pulled down by 3 whites and torn apart before anyone could reach him. 2 watch brothers from the ranging party died when a white burst through the wall of a hut behind them, and a man named Darren, young, barely 18, took a white's axe through his leg and bled out in the snow, while Sam tried to stop the bleeding with strips of cloth but turned red too fast. Jon stood over the burning corpses and watched the blue fade from their eyes. The flames threw wild shadows across the village, and the smell was something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Rotting meat and ancient cold and something else, something sweet and wrong, like flowers growing in a grave. He found Sam sitting alone near one of the huts, his hands still covered in Darren's blood. "I couldn't stop it," Sam whispered. "The bleeding. I couldn't." "You tried. Trying isn't enough when someone is dying in front of you." Jon sat down beside him. The fire crackled. Around them, men were checking bodies, making sure the dead stayed dead, stabbing anything that moved with dragonglass or burning it where it lay. "Sam, the thing you said about dragonglass killing walkers. You're certain?" "I stabbed it and it shattered." "I'm certain. Could a dragonglass spearhead do the same?" "I don't see why not. The material is the same. It's the obsidian that kills them, not the shape." Jon filed that away. Barristan cleaned his sword in the snow. His breathing was heavy, heavier than Jon had heard it after any fight in 9 years of training. There was a cut on his forearm where a white had gotten through his guard, a thing that would not have happened 5 years ago. The cold had slowed him. Not much, a fraction of a second, a hair's width on the parry. But against things that felt no pain and never tired, a fraction of a second was a lifetime. "You're hurt," Jon said. "A scratch." Barristan wrapped the cut without looking at it. His hands were steady, but Jon noticed that his left hand was shaking slightly, a fine tremor that might have been cold and might have been something else. "That was 30 whites," Barristan said quietly. "One village. If Sam is right about the numbers, tens of thousands," Jon said. "And these were the weakest. Old corpses, barely preserved. Imagine fresher dead. Imagine soldiers. Imagine the brothers who died at the fist, armed with good steel and dressed in black, standing back up with those blue eyes." The thought sat between them like a stone. "I watched them move," Barristan continued. "They have no technique, no discipline, no tactics. But they don't need any of that. They don't tire, they don't feel pain, and they don't stop. A master swordsman can kill 1, 10, 20, but eventually his arm gives out, and theirs don't. That's the equation, Jon. That's what we're fighting. Not skill against skill. Endurance against infinity." Jon looked north, into the darkness beyond the firelight. "We need to go back." "Yes, and we need the wildlings." Barristan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the burning dead, at the men who'd survived, at the dark forest pressing in around them. "Yes, we do." They found the wildlings on the way back. A scouting party, 20 strong, moving south through the haunted forest with the careful speed of people who knew exactly what was behind them. They nearly fought. Jon's men drew weapons when they saw the furs and the bone armor, and the wildlings scattered into the trees with the practiced ease of people who had been running from things in forests their entire lives. Jon sheathed Longclaw and walked forward alone. "I'm Jon Snow," he said to the trees, "son of Ned Stark. I'm not here to fight you." Silence. Then a woman stepped out from behind a weirwood tree. She was lean and red-haired, and she held a bone bow with an arrow nocked, aimed at Jon's chest from 10 paces. "You're a crow," she said. "Or you're with crows." Same thing. I'm neither. I'm from Winterfell. Then what are you doing north of the wall? Looking for the dead. We found them. Jon gestured behind him, where his men stood with their weapons drawn. We need to speak with Mance Rayder. The woman stared at him. Her eyes moved to Barristan, to the quality of their armor, to the 200 men visible through the trees. You want to talk to Mance? Actually, talk? I want to offer him a way through the wall. The arrow lowered an inch. You can do that? I can try. Her name was Val, and she did not trust them. She made that clear during the 3 days it took to reach Mance's camp. She walked at the front of their column with the easy stride of someone who had been walking through frozen wilderness her entire life. And she spoke to Jon only when necessary. And when she spoke, her words had the careful precision of someone choosing each one for maximum damage. Your watch killed my brother, she said on the first night, when they made camp in a hollow between 2 ridges. Rangers, they came in the night and took him while he was hunting. Said he was a raider. He was hunting elk. I'm sorry, Jon said. Don't be sorry. Be different. She looked at him across the fire, and her eyes were the color of cold water. That's what matters. Whether you're different from the rest of them. Barristan watched the exchange from across the camp and said nothing. But later, when they were alone, he said, She's testing you. I know. She's also right. On the second day, they passed a frozen lake where the ice had cracked in patterns that looked deliberate, geometric shapes scored into the surface as if drawn by an enormous hand. Val skirted the lake without looking at it, but Jon saw the way her hand moved to the bone knife at her hip. The walkers did that, she said when Jon asked. They mark their territory. The ice remembers their passing the way mud remembers a boot print. On the 3rd morning, Val led them to Mance Rayder's camp. Jon had tried to imagine the wildling army. Nothing he imagined came close. It spread across a frozen valley like a second city, tens of thousands of tents and lean-tos and open fires stretching from one ridge to the next. People moved between the fires in an endless current. Giants walked among them, actual giants, 12 feet tall with matted fur and clubs made from whole trees. Mammoths stood in crude corrals, their breath rising in clouds that obscured the stars. Gods, one of Jon's men whispered. Barristan said nothing. But Jon saw the old knight's hand tighten on his reins, and his eyes moved across the camp with the practiced calculation of a man who had spent a lifetime assessing military strength. Jon could almost hear him counting. 100,000, Barristan murmured. At least. Closer to 90, Val said. We lost 10,000 at Hardhome. She said it flatly, the way people stated facts that had broken them so completely the break no longer registered. What happened at Hardhome? Jon asked. The dead came, took the whole settlement in a single night. Everyone who died got back up. We went from 90,000 fleeing south to 100,000, except 10,000 of them were trying to kill the other 90. She looked at Jon. That's what's coming for your wall, Crow. That's what's been coming since before your grandfather was born. So when you say you want to offer us a way through, I very much hope you mean it. Mance Rayder was not what Jon expected. He was a slight man, unremarkable in his furs, with a weathered face and quick eyes that missed nothing. He wore no crown, carried no scepter, bore no symbols of rank. He sat by a fire like any other man, and the people around him deferred to him with the easy familiarity of trust earned, not demanded. He looked up when Jon entered his tent, and his eyes went to Longclaw on Jon's hip. Valyrian steel, Mance said. You're either very rich or very important. I'm Jon Snow, Ned Stark's boy. Mance leaned back. I knew your uncle. Benjen, good man. He came north of the wall and never came back. A pause. Most don't. I need to talk to you about the wall. You need to talk to me about opening it. Jon stared at him. Mance smiled, thin and tired. I didn't unite 90 clans and convince giants to march beside Thames because I wanted to sack a castle. Boy, I did it because the dead are coming, and that wall is the only thing between my people and annihilation. Every day we spend on this side of it is a day the army behind us gets larger. So yes, I know what you want to talk about, The question is whether you can deliver what you're offering. Jon sat down across the fire from the king beyond the wall. Barristan stood behind him, silent, watchful. I can get you through the wall, Jon said. All of you. But I need something in return. You need us to fight. I need you to fight beside the Night's Watch, not against them, with them. When the dead come for the wall, and they will, I need every sword and every bow on the same side. Mance studied him. The fire crackled between them. My people have been fighting crows for 8,000 years, and the dead have been waiting for 8,000 years. They're more patient than either of us. Your watch won't accept it. They'll see us as the enemy. They'll see opening the gate as treason. Probably. That's my problem, not yours. It'll be my problem when they put arrows in my people coming through. They won't. I'll be standing at the gate when it opens. Mance looked at Barristan. And who are you, old man? Barristan Selmy. Something changed in Mance's expression. A flicker of recognition, of respect, earned at a distance. Even beyond the wall, men knew that name. The Bold. I heard songs about you before I could walk. Mance looked back at Jon. Ned Stark's bastard, and the greatest knight in the world, riding north to fight the dead. If I were still a singer, I'd write a song about it. I'd rather you marched your people south. Through the wall. Through the wall. Settle in the gift. The land is empty, has been for years. Farm it, hunt it, live on it. In exchange, when the dead come, you fight. And after, when the dead are beaten, if they can be beaten, your lords will want us gone. After is after. Right now, today, the choice is simple. Come through the wall and live, or stay here and die. And when you die, you'll stand back up and kill the people I'm trying to protect. Mance was quiet for a long time. The fire burned low between them, and somewhere outside the tent, a giant rumbled something in the old tongue that sounded like distant thunder. You're asking me to trust a Stark. I'm asking you to trust someone who's seen what's out there. I fought them 3 days ago. A village, 30 whites. My men killed them with fire and lost 4 good soldiers doing it. 30. Jon leaned forward. You have 100,000 people in this camp, Mance, when the Night King's army hits you. And it will. How many of your people die in the first hour? And how many of those dead stand back up? Mance didn't answer. He didn't have to. Your father, Mance said finally. They said Ned Stark was the most honorable man in Westeros. They cut his head off for it. I know. I'm asking if you're like him. I'm trying to be. Mance reached into the furs beside him and pulled out a horn. It was black, ancient, cracked along its length, and carved with symbols that Jon couldn't read. Do you know what this is? Jon shook his head. I found it buried in the Frostfangs, in a cave that had been sealed for 8,000 years. The old songs call it the Horn of Winter. They say if you blow it, the wall comes down. The tent was very quiet. I've never blown it, Mance said. I could have. When the Watch refused to let my people through, when they killed my scouts and turned my envoys away, I could have put this horn to my lips and brought down 700 feet of ice and magic. I didn't, because I'm not a monster. Because bringing down the wall doesn't save my people. It dooms everyone. He set the horn down between them. That should tell you something about who I am. Jon looked at the horn, at the cracks running through its surface, at the faded carvings of an age before the wall existed. It tells me you're a man who understands consequences, Jon said. So understand this one. I'm not offering you charity. I'm not offering you mercy. I'm offering you a trade. Your lives for your swords, your survival for your service. And if you take the deal, you keep that horn locked away somewhere deep and dark. And no one ever speaks of it again. Mance studied him for a long, unreadable moment. Then he picked up the horn and held it out. Take it. A gesture of good faith. Jon took the horn. It was heavier than it looked, and cold, and something in its weight felt like the gravity of the world itself. Mance stood. He was shorter than Jon, which surprised him. I'll give you 3 days, Mance said. Go back to your wall, open that gate, and send word. If the gate opens, we march through. If it doesn't, He spread his hands. Then we go through it the other way, and more people die than need to. On both sides. 3 days. The dead don't negotiate. Snow. 3 days is generous. Jon rode south with his heart hammering against his ribs and a decision already made that he knew might cost him everything. He carried the Horn of Winter in his saddlebag, and its weight was negligible, and its significance was staggering. A weapon that could bring down the wall, handed to him by a man who could have used it, but chose not to. Trust given as proof that trust could be returned. Barristan rode beside him in silence for the first hour, letting Jon think, the way he always did when the problem was too large for advice. The old knight's face was drawn with cold, his cheeks raw where the wind had scoured them, and his hands were wrapped so thick in cloth that his grip on the reins looked like a mummer's padding. But his back was straight. His eyes were clear. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to say the right thing at the right moment. "Thorn will refuse," Jon said finally. "Almost certainly. The brothers will call it treason. Many of them. And if I do it anyway, if I open that gate without their permission, I'll be breaking every oath the Night's Watch has ever sworn. You're not Night's Watch, Jon. You never swore those oaths. No, but the men who guard that gate did, and I'm asking them to break theirs." Barristan was quiet for a long time. The horses' hooves crunched through crusted snow, and the wall grew on the southern horizon, that impossible shelf of ice blotting out the stars. "Do you remember what I told you after the Karstark execution?" Barristan asked. Jon frowned. "You told me a lot of things after the Karstark execution. I told you that Robb was right to take the head and wrong in how he handled what came after. That justice without wisdom is just another form of cruelty. Do you remember?" "I remember. This is the opposite problem. You're right about the wildlings. Every calculation, military and moral, says the same thing. Let them through or they become the enemy's soldiers. But being right isn't enough. You have to be right in a way that people can follow. How? Win them. Not all of them. You'll never convince Thorn. But the others, the brothers who are afraid and looking for someone to tell them what to do, give them a reason to follow you instead of him. Show them the dead. Show them what's coming. Let them choose." Jon looked at his mentor. "And if they choose wrong, then you do what you believe is right and accept the consequences. That's what your father did. That's what every good leader does. My father died for it." Yes, Barristan's voice was steady. And the world was worse for his death. But it would have been worse still if he'd betrayed what he believed to save himself. That's the bargain, Jon. That's what leadership costs. You don't get to know the outcome before you choose. They reached Castle Black in a day and a half, riding hard. The horses were blown, the men exhausted, and Barristan dismounted with a stiffness that he tried to hide and couldn't. Jon watched him catch himself on the saddle, just for a second, his weight shifting as his left knee refused to take the load. Then the old knight straightened, released the horse, and walked toward the castle as if nothing had happened. Jon found him that evening, sitting by the fire in the armory, rubbing a foul-smelling liniment into his knee. The joint was swollen, visibly larger than the other, and the skin around it was an angry purple. "I'm fine," Barristan said before Jon could speak. "I didn't ask. You were going to." Barristan worked the liniment deeper. The cold aggravates it. "By morning it'll be passable. By morning we'll be standing in front of 300 men trying to convince them to open the wall. Then I suggest we both get some sleep." Barristan looked up. "Stop worrying about me, Jon. Worry about the argument you're going to make tomorrow. That's the fight that matters." Jon called a meeting in the common hall. Not just Thorn and the senior brothers, but everyone. Every man of the Night's Watch at Castle Black and every soldier Jon had brought from the south. 300 men crowded into a hall built for twice that number, and the heat of their bodies turned the frozen air to steam. Jon told them what he'd seen. He described the dead village, the whites rising from the frozen ground, the blue eyes that burned without heat. He described the fight, the 4 men he'd lost, the way the dead kept coming until you burned them or took their heads. He described the wildling camp, The 90,000 people huddled in a valley, running from something that never stopped and never tired and never needed to eat or sleep or rest. In 3 days, Jon said, Mance Rayder's people will reach this wall. 90,000 men, women, and children. They can come through the gate as allies, or they can die against it and stand back up as enemies. Those are the only 2 options. The hall erupted. Men shouted. Fists pounded tables. Thorne stood and called Jon a traitor, a wildling lover. A bastard who'd sell the wall for a pat on the head from savages. Half the watch roared in agreement. The other half sat in terrified silence, which was worse. Jon let them shout. He stood at the front of the hall and took it all, the anger and the fear and the hatred, and he waited the way Barristan had taught him. Let the storm blow itself out. When the noise finally died, it was Sam who spoke. I've seen them, Sam said. His voice shook, but he stood anyway, this round, soft, frightened man. And he stood in front of 300 soldiers and said what needed saying, at the fist of the first men. The dead came, and we ran, and we're still running. Lord Commander Mormont is dead. 54 of our brothers are dead, and every single one of them is a white now, fighting for the Night King. He looked around the hall. Jon Snow is telling you the truth. I was there. I saw it. And I'd rather have 90,000 wildlings standing on our side of the wall than standing on theirs. The silence after Sam spoke was different from the silence before. It was the silence of men recalculating. Thorne called for a vote. He was confident. The Night's Watch elected its leaders, and he had spent weeks consolidating support, rewarding the men who backed him and punishing those who didn't. He lost. It wasn't close. The brothers of the Night's Watch, faced with a choice between a man who offered certainty and a man who offered survival, chose survival by a margin of nearly 2-1. Thorne stood in the common hall and watched the hands rise against him, and his face went the color of old ash. You're making him Lord Commander, Thorne said to the hall. A man who isn't even one of us, a bastard from Winterfell who's been here less than a fortnight. You're handing him the watch. No one's handing me anything, Jon said. I didn't ask for this. That's what they all say. Maester Aemon spoke from his chair near the fire. He was ancient, blind, wrapped in furs so thick he seemed more blanket than man, but his voice carried through the hall with a clarity that silenced every other sound. The Night's Watch takes no part in the wars of the realm, Aemon said. But the war that is coming is not a war of the realm. It is a war for the realm, for every realm, for the living against the dead. And in that war, we will need every sword. He turned his blind eyes toward Jon, as if he could see him through the milky cataracts. Do what must be done, Lord Commander. Jon Snow was not a man of the Night's Watch. He had never sworn the oath, never stood before a weirwood tree and pledged his life to the wall. But the Watch chose him anyway, because the thing that was coming didn't care about oaths or traditions or the way things had always been done. The thing that was coming cared about nothing at all. And the men who stood against it needed someone who cared about everything. He opened the gate 3 days later. The wildlings came through in a river of fur and bone and desperation. They came on foot and on horseback and on the backs of mammoths. They came carrying children and dragging the elderly and herding animals that had never seen the south side of the wall. They came in silence. Mostly, the stunned quiet of people who had spent months running and had finally, impossibly, reached a door that opened instead of closing. Jon stood at the gate and watched them pass. Some of them looked at him with gratitude, some with suspicion, some with hatred so pure it was almost admirable. The hatred of people who had been told their entire lives that the men behind this wall were their enemies, now walking through the enemy's gate and trusting the enemy's word. The giants came last. They ducked through the tunnel with their enormous heads bowed, and the ice groaned around them as they passed. Ghost watched them from Jon's side, his red eyes tracking their movement, and the giants watched Ghost in return with something that might have been recognition. Old magic, meeting old magic in a tunnel of ancient ice. It took most of the day. 90,000 people moving through a tunnel wide enough for 2 horses, filing out into the gift like water through a crack in a dam. Jon watched the faces as they passed. Old men who leaned on walking sticks and shuffled through the tunnel with the careful steps of people who had been told they would never reach the other side. Women carrying infants so bundled in furs that only their eyes were visible, dark and round and staring at the ice ceiling above them. Children who walked in silence, holding hands. Their faces showing none of the curiosity that children should have, because children who had seen the dead walk had no curiosity left. A woman stopped in front of Jon and held her child out to him. Not to give, just to show. The child's face was thin and wind-burned, and its eyes were the deep brown of ironwood bark. He was born during the march, the woman said. I didn't think he'd live. I didn't think any of us would live. Jon looked at the child. The child looked back. He'll live, Jon said. I promise. The woman nodded once and walked through the gate, carrying her child into the south. By dusk, the fields south of the wall were covered with campfires, and the air smelled of cooking meat and smoke, and the particular musk of people who had been running for too long. Thorne watched from the top of the wall. He said nothing, but his hand never left his sword. Jon found him there after the last wildling had passed through. It's done, Jon said. It is. I need you, Thorne. I need every man who can hold a weapon. Whatever you think of me, whatever you think of what I've done, the dead are coming, and when they get here, it won't matter who stood on which side of any argument. Thorne looked at him. His eyes were cold, but they were clear, and in them Jon saw something he hadn't expected. Not respect. Something closer to resignation. The look of a man who had fought a battle he knew was right and lost it to a man he believed was wrong, and who was now faced with the possibility that he was the one who had been wrong all along. I'll hold the wall, Thorne said. Not for you. For the watch. I don't care who you hold it for. Just hold it. Thorne nodded once and walked away, and Jon stood on top of the wall in the gathering dark and looked north. The haunted forest stretched to the horizon, black under the stars. Somewhere out there, an army of the dead was marching south. He could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, a pressure in the bones that had nothing to do with cold. Barristan climbed the stairs to join him. It took the old knight longer than it would have a year ago, and when he reached the top, his breathing was audible in the silence. Jon pretended not to notice. It's done, Jon said. The easy part is done, Barristan corrected. 90,000 wildlings and 600 brothers in the same castle. How long before someone draws a blade? I've posted mixed patrols. Wildlings and watch together. Val is helping organize the free folk side. The red-haired woman? She's Mance's sister by marriage. The wildlings respect her. And the watch? Ed Tollett, Sam, a few others who understand what we're facing. The rest? Jon shrugged. The rest will come around, or they won't. That's not good enough, and you know it. Jon looked at his mentor. Then tell me what is. Barristan leaned against the parapet, and the ice fog swirled around him, and he looked like what he was, an old man, far from home, standing on the edge of the world in a war he'd never imagined. Give them something to do, Barristan said. Idle men fight each other. Working men don't have the energy. Build defenses, dig trenches, make weapons, train the wildlings to fight in formation, and train the watch to fight beside them. Make them too tired to hate each other. You're talking about building an army. I'm talking about building a chance. Barristan straightened. I've fought in more battles than I can remember, Jon, and I've learnt one thing that matters more than tactics, or terrain, or the quality of your steel. The side that fights together wins. The side that fights alone dies. Whatever else you do, make them fight together. Jon did. The first knife was drawn on the second day. A watch brother named Ollie, young and hard-eyed, whose parents had been killed in a wildling raid 3 years before, pulled a blade on a Then warrior over a place at the fire pit. The Then knocked the knife away and put his fist through Ollie's jaw before anyone could intervene. Within seconds, a dozen men on each side were reaching for weapons, and the courtyard teetered on the edge of a massacre. Jon walked between them. He walked into the gap between the two groups, unarmed, his hands at his sides, and he stopped in the exact center of the space where violence was about to happen. "Put them down," he said, not shouting, speaking, the voice Barristan had taught him. The command voice, the one that came from the belly and carried authority the way a sword carries an edge. "All of you." Now, they hesitated. Wildlings looked at Watch Brothers. Watch Brothers looked at Wildlings. Everyone looked at Jon, standing alone between them, offering himself as the first casualty if anyone decided to start. "I lost 4 men north of the wall fighting the dead," Jon said. 4 good soldiers who are rotting in the snow right now because they died, so I could come back and tell you what's out there. I will not lose one more to stupidity." He looked at Ollie. "You have a right to your grief. You do not have a right to start a war with the people standing between you and the dead." He looked at the Then, "And you. If one of my men draws a blade on you, you come to me. You don't solve it with your fists. Not here. Not now." The weapons went down. Not happily, not willingly. But they went down. After that, Jon posted guards at every point where Wildlings and Watch intersected. Shared meals in the common hall, with assigned seating that kept the angriest men apart. Paired work details, so that a Wildling who hated crows had to dig beside one all day, and a crow who hated Wildlings had to rely on one to haul timber. It was crude and it was uncomfortable, and on 3 occasions in the first week, Jon had to physically step between men who wanted to kill each other. But slowly, grudgingly, the killing urge gave way to exhaustion. And exhaustion gave way to the dim recognition that the man you were digging beside was just as cold and tired and frightened as you were. Over the next 2 weeks, Castle Black became something it hadn't been in living memory, a real military installation. Jon organized the combined force into companies of 50, each one a mix of Night's Watch, Northern soldiers, and Wildlings. He appointed commanders based on ability rather than origin, which caused fury on all sides until people realized it worked. The Wildlings knew things the Watch didn't. They knew how to survive north of the wall, how to read the weather in the ice, how to build fires that burned hot in conditions that should have extinguished them. They knew which plants could be boiled for medicine, which berries staved off the bleeding gums that came from a diet of salt meat, and how to layer clothing so that sweat didn't freeze against the skin. The Watch knew the wall itself. Every stair and tunnel and murder hole knew how to defend from height, knew the mechanics of siege warfare that the free folk had never needed to learn. Jon forced them to teach each other. Barristan trained the fighters. Every morning before dawn, he was in the yard. At 67, he couldn't demonstrate the way he once had, couldn't fight for hours without rest, couldn't absorb the blows that would have bounced off him at 30. But he could teach. He could watch a man swing a sword once and identify 4 things wrong with his grip. He could see a shield wall form and know, before anyone else, where it would break. Tormund Giantsbane, the largest and loudest of the Wildling leaders, was the first to challenge him. The red-bearded giant stood in the yard on the second morning and declared that he didn't take orders from a crow, a southerner, or a man old enough to be his grandfather. "Then, take a lesson instead," Barristan said, and drew his sword. Tormund was 6.5 feet tall and strong enough to wrestle a bear. He swung a greatsword one-handed that most men couldn't lift with 2. He came at Barristan with a roar that shook snow from the rafters. Barristan sidestepped the first swing, redirected the second with the flat of his blade, and put his sword point against Tormund's throat before the Wildling could wind up for a third. The yard went silent. Barristan held the position for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then he lowered his blade and stepped back. "You're strong," Barristan said, "possibly the strongest man I've ever seen, but you fight angry, and angry men make mistakes." He sheathed his sword. "I can teach you to fight without anger, or you can keep swinging at the air. Your choice." Tormund stared at him. Then the big man threw back his head and laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a mountain. "I like you, old man. You've got stones. Fine, teach me." After that, the Wildlings came to the yard. Barristan taught them the fundamentals: footwork, balance, how to hold a line without breaking, how to fight beside the man next to you instead of wandering off to find individual glory. The Wildlings were fierce and fearless and utterly undisciplined, and beating that discipline into them was like trying to train a pack of wolves to march in formation. He taught them to fight the dead. Forget everything you know about fighting men, Barristan told a group of 30 wildlings on the 4th morning. Men have patterns. They favor their strong hand. They flinch when they're hurt. They slow down when they're tired. The dead do none of these things. They come straight at you, always forward, never stopping, never retreating. The only way to beat them is to not be where they expect you to be. He demonstrated with Jon, the two of them sparring in the center of the yard while the wildlings watched. Jon played the white, walking forward mechanically, arms reaching, no footwork, no defense. Barristan showed them how to sidestep, how to let the dead man's momentum carry him past, how to strike the neck from behind. The whites are simple, Barristan said. Dangerous, but simple. The walkers are different. They think. They adapt. If you meet one, run. Unless you have dragonglass in your hand, run. And if we have dragonglass? A wildling woman asked. Then stand your ground and aim for the gaps in their armor. They wear ice, but it has seams. Under the arm. The base of the throat. Behind the knee. He paused. And don't miss. You won't get a second chance. But Barristan was patient. He had trained Jon Snow from a wild boy of 7 into the finest young swordsman in Westeros. He had decades of patience stored in his bones like warmth against the cold, and he spent them freely on these fierce, undisciplined people who had never known anything but the wild freedom of the north. Jon watched from the wall one morning as Barristan walked down the line of wildling fighters, correcting stances, adjusting grips, showing a woman named Carsey how to angle her shield so that a blow glanced instead of broke. He's remarkable, Val said, appearing beside Jon. She'd taken to climbing the wall's stairs each morning, and she did it without breathing hard, which made Jon feel inadequate. He is, how old? 67. He moves like 40. He used to move like 20. When I was a boy, I thought he was invincible. Jon watched Barristan demonstrate a parry to a group of Thenn warriors. I know better now. But sometimes I forget. Val was quiet for a moment. He's dying, isn't he? Jon turned to her sharply. What? The cold. I've seen it before, in our elders. The way his hand curls in the morning. The way he breathes after climbing stairs. The cold gets into old bones and doesn't leave. It's not a wound, it's just time. Jon said nothing. He'd noticed the same things and refused to name them. He won't stop, Jon said. No, men like that never stop. They go until they break. Val looked at him with something that might have been compassion. You should say whatever you need to say to him, Jon Snow, while you can. Jon thought about that for the rest of the day. He thought about it through a dispute between Watch Brothers and wildlings over sleeping quarters. He thought about it through a meeting with Mance about patrol schedules. He thought about it through an evening meal of hard bread and salt beef that tasted like leather. That night, he went to find Barristan. The old knight was in the armory, oiling his sword. Always oiling his sword. Some things never changed. Sit down, Barristan said without looking up. You've been thinking loud enough for me to hear from across the castle. Jon sat. Val says the cold is killing you. Barristan's hand paused on the blade, then resumed. Val is a perceptive woman. Is she right? I'm 67 years old, Jon. Everything is killing me. The cold is simply faster about it than most things. He set down the cloth. My sword hand is slower than it was a year ago. My left knee doesn't bend properly in the cold. I can feel my heartbeat in my chest at night, which is something that happens to old men and shouldn't concern young ones. It concerns me. I know. That's because you're a better man than you realize. Barristan looked at him, and his eyes were the same blue they'd been in the yard at Winterfell, steady and clear and utterly without self-pity. I'm not dying today, Jon, or tomorrow. I have time enough for what needs to be done. What needs to be done is surviving. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not proving anything. I'm doing my job. Barristan sheathed the sword and set it against the wall. Do you remember the first thing I ever taught you? Jon thought back. Winterfell, the yard. A wooden sword that was too heavy for his 7-year-old hands. Footwork, before that. Jon frowned. I asked you why you wanted to fight. Do you remember what you said? No, you said. Because they all fight and no one will teach me properly. You were 7 years old. And you were angry. And you were right. No one was teaching you properly because no one thought a bastard was worth the effort. Barristan leaned back in his chair. I thought you were worth the effort. I still do. That's why I'm here, Jon. Not because of duty or honor or the memory of a dead prince. Because of you. Jon felt something tighten in his throat. He'd spent years learning to control his face, to keep his emotions behind a wall as solid as the one he now defended. Barristan had taught him that too. But some walls had cracks. There's something I need to tell you, Barristan said. Something I should have told you years ago. Jon looked up. Not tonight. Barristan said, soon, when the time is right. But soon. That's what you always say. I know. And I'm running out of time to keep saying it. Barristan stood, and his knee popped, and he ignored it with the practiced ease of a man who had been ignoring pain his entire life. Get some sleep, Jon. Tomorrow we start building fire trenches. Jon didn't sleep. He lay in his quarters and listened to the wind howl against the wall and thought about all the things Barristan hadn't said. The way Varys had whispered both of your fathers in the corridors of the Red Keep. The way Jaime Lannister had looked at him in the practice yard and said you fight like someone I used to know. The way Barristan's eyes went distant sometimes, looking at Jon as if he were seeing someone else. He thought about his mother, the woman Ned Stark had refused to name. The woman no one would speak of, the woman who existed only as an absence, a silence shaped like a question that no one would answer. He thought about the dead, the blue eyes in the dark, the army that was coming. He thought about all of it, and he slept, and when he slept, he dreamed of dragons. The fire trenches took 8 days to dig. Jon designed them based on what he'd seen at the Wildling village, sitting in the library with Sam and Barristan, drawing lines on a map of the wall's north approach by candlelight. The dead feared fire. It was the one weapon that killed them absolutely, that didn't just slow them or dismember them, but destroyed them completely. So Jon ordered trenches dug in concentric arcs north of the wall, 3 rings deep, each one filled with oil-soaked timber that could be lit at a moment's notice. The outer ring was 300 yards from the wall. The inner ring was 50. The design was Barristan's refinement of Jon's idea. The old knight had spent decades studying siege warfare, and he approached the defense of the wall with the same methodical precision he'd brought to every battlefield. He drew the trench lines on the map with the careful hand of a man who understood that the difference between a well-placed defense and a poorly placed one was measured in lives. 3 arcs, not circles, Barristan said, tapping the map. We don't need to defend the flanks. The dead will come from the north, directly at the tunnel. We concentrate our fire where they concentrate their attack. Between the trenches, they built barricades. Sharpened stakes driven into the frozen ground at angles, designed to impede movement, to slow anything that was walking upright and funnel it into kill zones where archers on the wall could rain fire down from above. The stakes were ironwood, scavenged from the haunted forest by wildling work crews who ventured beyond the wall in daylight and returned before dusk, dragging timber behind them. It was brutal work. The ground was frozen to a depth of 2 feet, and every inch had to be broken with picks and iron bars. The cold turned metal brittle and made wooden hafts crack, and men broke tools as fast as the watch's smiths could repair them. Jon worked beside his men, stripped to his shirt despite the cold, swinging a pick until his shoulders burned and his palms bled through his gloves. He worked beside wildlings and watch brothers, and his own northerners, and the work made them equal in a way that no speech or argument could have achieved. Barristan supervised the design, walking the lines with a critical eye that missed nothing. The gaps between the stakes are too wide, Barristan said on the 3rd day. Whites don't care about wounds. They'll push through. Jon narrowed the gaps. The oil channels are too shallow, Barristan said on the 5th day. If the ground freezes the oil before you light it, the trenches are useless. Jon dug deeper channels and covered them with hides. The retreat paths are too narrow, Barristan said on the 7th day. When the outer defenses fall, and they will fall, the men need to pull back to the second ring without bottlenecking. Jon widened the paths. It was exhausting work, and it was necessary, and it kept 300 men too tired to fight each other. Barristan had been right about that. By the end of the first week, the hatred between wildlings and Watch hadn't disappeared, but it had been buried under a layer of shared suffering that felt, if not like camaraderie, at least like mutual recognition that they were all equally cold, equally tired, and equally unlikely to survive what was coming. Mance Rayder came to the wall on the 9th day. He walked the defences with Jon and Barristan, studying the trenches and barricades with the eye of a man who had fought his own battles and lost some of them. "It's good work," Mance said. "Better than anything we've built. But it won't hold." "It doesn't have to hold forever," Jon said. "It has to hold long enough. Long enough for what? Long enough for us to kill whatever is leading them." Mance looked at him. "You think killing the walkers will stop the dead?" "Sam told me that when he killed the walker, the whites nearby collapsed, as if whatever was animating them died with it. One walker, a handful of whites. There are dozens of walkers out there, Snow, maybe hundreds, and the Night King commands them all. Then we kill the Night King." Mance stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. It was not a happy sound. "You're either very brave or very stupid. My father used to say there's a fine line between the two." "Your father was a wise man." Mance looked north, over the wall, into the white emptiness. "The Night King is old, Snow, older than the wall, older than your 7 kingdoms. He doesn't think like we do, doesn't want what we want. He just comes, like winter, like the tide. You can't negotiate with him. You can't reason with him. You can only fight him, and no one who's fought him has ever won." "No one who's fought him has had dragonglass," Jon said, "or Valyrian steel, or a wall 700 feet high. And no one who's fought him has had Barristan Selmy training their soldiers," Barristan added from behind them. Mance looked back at the old knight and shook his head slowly. "You really believe you can win this?" "I believe we have to try," Jon said. "The alternative is lying down and waiting to die. I've never been good at that." "No," Mance said. "I don't suppose you have." Messages came from the south, a raven from the twins, from Robb, written in his brother's hand. Robb was holding the Riverlands. The Freys had been subdued. Bolton had been imprisoned awaiting trial. The Northern Army was rebuilding, but slowly, and Robb could spare no men for the wall. He sent what he could, wagon loads of grain, salt beef, leather, and iron. And a single line at the bottom that Jon read 3 times. "Come home when it's done. That's an order from your king and a request from your brother." Jon folded the letter and put it in his pocket and tried not to think about whether he would survive long enough to obey either. Another raven, from Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon was dead, killed in some battle on the Black Water that Jon barely understood. Dragonstone was held by a skeleton garrison. The mountain of dragonglass that Sam had spoken about was still there, unclaimed and unmined. Jon sent ravens. To the lords of the Narrow Sea, to the maesters at Oldtown, to anyone who might listen. Dragonglass, obsidian, as much as could be mined and shipped north before the dead arrived. He had no authority to command these men and no leverage to persuade them, but he sent the ravens anyway, because doing nothing was not something Barristan had taught him. 12 days after the wildlings came through the wall, the first dragonglass shipment arrived. Not from Dragonstone. From Eastwatch by the sea, where a trading ship from Braavos had been carrying a hold full of obsidian intended for the glassblowers of Myr. The captain had heard about the dragonglass request and decided that selling it to desperate men at the end of the world was more profitable than hauling it across the Narrow Sea. It was enough to arm 300 men with dragonglass weapons. Spearheads, arrowheads, daggers. The Watch's smiths worked day and night, and Barristan stood over them and insisted on quality. "A dragonglass spearhead that shatters on the first thrust is worse than none at all," he said. "It gives a man false confidence. Make them thick, make them sturdy, and make them sharp." Jon distributed the weapons based on skill, not loyalty. The best fighters got the dragonglass regardless of whether they were Watch, Northern, or Wildling. Thorne received a dragonglass dagger without comment and wore it on his belt beside his steel. Longclaw was the only Valyrian steel weapon at Castle Black. Jon wore it constantly, slept with it beside his bed, felt naked without its weight on his hip. Sam had told him that Valyrian steel could kill White Walkers as surely as dragonglass, and Longclaw had been tested on Whites during the ranging. It cut through dead flesh as if the flesh were air. They had fire, they had dragonglass, they had the wall. Jon stood on its top and looked north and tried to believe it would be enough. Barristan found him there on the 14th night. The old knight had climbed the stairs slowly, and Jon could hear him coming for a full minute before he appeared. That would have been impossible a year ago. Barristan Selmy did not announce his presence unless he chose to. "I need to talk to you," Barristan said. Jon turned. The wind was blowing from the north, carrying ice crystals that stung his face. Above them, the stars burned with the cold, bright clarity of a sky untouched by fire or cloud. "You said soon. Is this soon?" "This is soon." Barristan leaned against the parapet. 700 feet below them, the fires of Castle Black flickered like stars themselves, a mirror of the sky above. Beyond the wall, the haunted forest was dark. No fires. No movement. The stillness of a world holding its breath. "When I came to Winterfell," Barristan said, "I was there to deliver Theon Greyjoy. That was my purpose. Your father had won the Greyjoy rebellion, and Robert tasked me with bringing the hostage north. A simple errand for a knight of the Kingsguard." "I know this," Jon said. "You know the surface of it. You don't know why I stayed." Jon waited. "I watched you fight in the yard. You were 7 years old, swinging a practice sword against a wooden post, and you were terrible. Your grip was wrong, your footwork was worse, and you kept dropping your shoulder on the backswing." Barristan's voice softened. "But the rhythm was right. The way you moved, the way your weight shifted from foot to foot, the natural balance of your strikes. I'd seen that rhythm before. Once, in a man who died 17 years before you were born. The wind blew. The ice groaned. Jon felt something enormous opening beneath him, a chasm he had sensed his entire life without ever being able to name it. "Rhaegar Targaryen," Jon said. Barristan looked at him sharply. "You know, I've suspected. For a long time." Jon's voice was steady, though his hands were not. "Varys said both of your fathers. Jaime said I fought like someone he used to know. And you looked at me sometimes like you were seeing a ghost." "Not a ghost," Barristan said. "A legacy. Tell me." Barristan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright, and Jon realized with a shock that the old knight was fighting tears. In 9 years, Jon had never seen Barristan Selmy cry. "Rhaegar Targaryen was the finest man I ever knew. Not the finest king, not the finest warrior, the finest man. He was gentle, and he was thoughtful, and he read more books than any prince should. He played the harp so beautifully that it made men weep, and then he'd put down the harp and pick up a sword and fight with a grace that made the weeping seem inadequate." Barristan paused, gathering himself. "He fell in love with your mother, Lyanna Stark, not the abduction the histories tell, not the kidnapping that Robert believed. Love, real, desperate, impossible love. The kind that ends kingdoms." "And started a war," Jon said. "Yes, and started a war. They married in secret, before a heart tree, with a septon who should have known better, and 2 witnesses who never spoke of it afterward. And when Robert's rebellion came, and when the war tore the realm apart, Lyanna went to a place called the Tower of Joy in the Mountains of Dawn. She went there to be safe. She went there to have you." Jon's legs felt uncertain beneath him. He leaned against the parapet and gripped the frozen stone until his knuckles whitened. "Your mother died, giving birth to you. Ned Stark found her in that tower, surrounded by blood and rose petals, and she made him promise. 'Promise me, Ned.' Those were her last words. She made him promise to protect you. Because if Robert found out, if anyone found out that Rhaegar Targaryen had a living son, he would have killed me. Robert loved Lyanna, or believed he did, and he hated Rhaegar with a fury that outlasted death. If he had known that Lyanna chose Rhaegar, that she loved Rhaegar, that she bore Rhaegar a son, yes, he would have killed you. He would have called it justice, and no one would have stopped him. So Ned Stark lied. Ned Stark did what he had to do. He took you home. He called you his bastard. He bore the shame of it, the whispers, the disappointment of his wife, because the alternative was your death. He chose your life over his honor. That's the measure of the man. Jon stared north. The darkness beyond the wall was total. No stars reached there. Nothing reached there. You knew, Jon said, from the beginning. You saw me fight, and you recognized Rhaegar's rhythm, and you knew. I suspected. The more I watched you, the more certain I became. And when I held you back at the Sept of Baelor, when I kept you from reaching Ned, I made a choice. The same choice Ned made. Your life over everything else. You should have told me. When? When you were 10 and wouldn't have understood. When you were 14 and would have ridden to King's Landing to demand your birthright and died for it. When your father was executed and you were half mad with grief. Barristan shook his head. There was never a right time. There was only the time that was least wrong. And that time is now. Because I don't know how many more chances I'll get. Jon's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the ice and let the cold burn them still. What does it mean? He asked. What am I? You are Jon Snow, raised by Ned Stark, trained by me, loved by everyone who has ever known you well enough to see what you are. Barristan's voice was firm now, the voice of a teacher delivering the most important lesson of all. Rhaegar gave you blood, Lyanna gave you life. Ned gave you honor. I tried to give you a sword arm. But what you are, Jon, what you truly are, is something none of us made. You made yourself. Every choice, every sacrifice, every time you stood when it was easier to kneel. That's you. Not Targaryen, not Stark. You, I'm the heir to the Iron Throne. If you want to be. I don't. I know, that's one of the reasons I trust you with it. Jon laughed. It came out broken, more breath than sound, but it was a laugh. You spent 9 years training me. Building me into a weapon, you said. Was that for Rhaegar? Were you building a Targaryen restoration? No. Barristan said it immediately, without hesitation. I was building a good man. The realm has had Targaryen kings and Baratheon kings, and it's bled under all of them. I wasn't trying to put a crown on your head, Jon. I was trying to make you the kind of man who could carry one, whether or not you ever chose to. They stood in silence on top of the wall, 700 feet above the world. The wind had died. The stars were very bright. Thank you, Jon said. For what? For staying. When you came to Winterfell, you were supposed to leave after 3 days. You stayed 9 years. It was the finest decision I ever made. Better than every battle, every tournament, every day I spent guarding kings. Barristan put his hand on Jon's shoulder. His grip was still strong. Not as strong as it had been, but strong enough. I promised your father I'd bring you home alive. I intend to keep that promise. Which father? Barristan smiled. It was rare enough that Jon memorized it. Both of them. They didn't speak of it again. There was no need. The truth sat between them like a third person, present but undemanding, and Jon found that it changed less than he'd expected. He was still Jon Snow. He still had a war to fight, men to lead, a wall to defend. The name of his father didn't alter the weight of the sword in his hand or the number of dead marching toward him. But it changed some things. Small things. The way he understood Ned Stark's silences. The way he recognized the sadness in Barristan's eyes when the old knight watched him fight. The way certain moments of his childhood rearranged themselves in his memory. Puzzle pieces clicking into place after years of not quite fitting. He thought about his mother, Lyanna Stark, a woman he'd never met, who died bringing him into the world. who'd loved a prince enough to start a war and loved her son enough to make her brother lie for 18 years. He wished he could have known her. He wished he could have told her that the lie worked, that he'd survived. He thought about Rhaegar, a man of books and music and swords, a man who played the harp and then picked up a blade, a man who'd started a war for love and died on the trident with another woman's name on his lips. Or maybe not. Maybe the name on his lips had been Lyanna's, and Robert simply hadn't been close enough to hear. He thought about Ned, the man who'd raised him, who'd called him son, who'd borne the shame of a lie for 18 years to keep a promise to a dying sister. The man who'd taught him about honor by living it, every day, in every choice, until honor killed him on the steps of a sept in a city full of liars. 3 fathers. 3 different kinds of love, 3 different legacies that had somehow converged into a single man standing on a wall of ice at the end of the world. Jon drew Longclaw and held it up to the starlight. Valyrian steel, forged in dragonfire, older than the kingdom that had forged it. A dragon's weapon in the hand of a dragon's son. He sheathed the sword and went to prepare for war. In the days that followed, Jon carried the truth like a stone in his chest. He told no one. Not Sam, not Val, not Tormund. The knowledge was too large, too heavy with consequence, and the timing was wrong. There would be a moment for it. After the battle. After the dead were beaten, if the dead could be beaten. For now, he was Jon Snow, Lord Commander, and the man people followed because they believed in what he was, not what his blood made him. But the truth changed the way he saw things. He looked at Longclaw and thought of dragons. He looked at the wall and wondered if the Targaryens who'd conquered Westeros had ever stood here, had ever looked north and felt the cold press against their fire-born blood. He thought about Maester Aemon, blind and ancient in his chair by the fire, and realized with a shock that the old man was his great-great-uncle, a Targaryen at the wall, hidden in plain sight, just like Jon. He almost went to Aemon, almost sat beside the blind man and said the words, "I'm one of you. I'm Rhaegar's son." But he didn't, because the words belonged to a world where names and bloodlines mattered. And this world, this frozen edge of existence where the dead were marching south, cared nothing for the politics of kings. He found Ghost instead. The direwolf was on the wall, standing at the parapet, staring north with his red eyes. Jon sat beside him and put his arm around the wolf's massive neck and pressed his face into the warm white fur. "You knew, didn't you?" Jon murmured. "You've always known." Ghost said nothing. Ghost never said anything. But he leaned into Jon, warm and solid and present, and the warmth of the wolf was real in a way that names and bloodlines and claims to thrones were not. The wolf didn't care if Jon was a Targaryen or a Stark or a bastard born of no one. The wolf cared about the man who fed him and ran with him and slept beside him. The wolf knew Jon the way a wolf knows its pack, by scent and by instinct and by the deep, unshakable certainty that this one belongs to me. Jon pressed his face deeper into the white fur and breathed, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight of 3 fathers and a kingdom of the dead and a wall of ice at the end of the world felt manageable. Then the moment passed, and he stood, and he went back to work. The scouts reported the army of the dead 4 days later. A ranging party had ridden 3 days north of the wall and returned in 2, their horses blown and their faces white. Not from cold, from what they'd seen. "It stretches from horizon to horizon," the lead scout said. His name was Pipe, a thin man with frightened eyes and a voice that shook. "We climbed a ridge, the tallest one we could find, and we looked north. I've seen armies, Lord Commander. I was at the Fist when the dead came. This was different. This was..." He searched for words and found none that fit. It was like watching the sea. It moved like the sea. Except the sea doesn't have blue eyes. The man beside Pip, a wildling scout named Harl, added quietly, "There are animals among them. Dead elk, dead bears, something that might have been a shadow cat. And the horses. Hundreds of dead horses ridden by things in ice armor. How fast?" Jon asked. "Walking speed. Steady. They don't stop, don't rest, don't eat. They just walk. The sound of it carries for miles. No war cries, no drums. Just the crunch of feet on frozen ground. All of them in step, like one enormous heartbeat. How long before they reach the wall? Pip swallowed. 3 days, 4 at most. They were 60 miles north when we turned south, and they're covering 15 miles a day. Maybe 20. It's hard to tell because they don't speed up and they don't slow down. They move the way the cold moves. Steady, certain, inevitable, Jon called the War Council. They met in the common hall, and for the first time since the wildlings had come through, there were no arguments, no shouting, no accusations, no ancient grudges dragged out and paraded. The men in that hall looked at each other and saw, perhaps for the first time, not enemies or strangers or the wrong kind of people, but the only allies they had. Jon laid out the defense. The wall is our greatest weapon. 700 feet of ice, and the dead can't climb it. They'll come from the north, and the only way through is the gate. The tunnel is our choke point. If we hold the tunnel, we hold the wall. Barristan spoke next. The fire trenches are our first line. When the dead reach them, we light them. That creates a barrier they can't cross. The barricades funnel them toward the center, where our archers can concentrate fire. Dragonglass arrows, fire arrows. Every shaft that hits a white is one less for the wall. The walkers will come with them, Jon continued. They hang back, let the whites do the work. But they're the key. Sam proved that killing a walker drops its whites. If we can reach the walkers... How? Thorne asked, not challenging. Asking, they stay behind the lines. We don't go to them. We draw them to us. Jon looked around the hall. The walkers are intelligent. They command. They adapt. If we threaten something they care about, they'll come forward. What do they care about? Tormund asked. The wall itself, Mansi said from the back of the hall. Everyone turned. The wall was built to stop them. It's the one thing that stands between them and the south. They don't just want to get past it. They want to bring it down. If they think they have a chance to break the wall, they'll commit everything. You want to use the wall as bait, Thorne said slowly. I want to use the tunnel, Jon said. The dead will push for the gate. They'll throw everything at it, because it's the only way through. When they commit, when the walkers come forward to lead the assault, that's when we strike. Strike with what? Tormund demanded. We've got 1 Valyrian steel sword and a few hundred dragonglass daggers. That's enough, Jon said. If we pick our moment. Barristan outlined the defensive formations. The wall's top would be manned by archers. The courtyard below would hold the reserve force, ready to reinforce wherever the line broke. The tunnel itself would be barricaded and held by the best fighters they had. I'll hold the tunnel, Barristan said. Jon's head snapped toward him. No, it's the most defensible position. 1 man in that tunnel is worth 50 in the open. The passage is narrow enough that the dead can only come at you 2 or 3 at a time. It negates their numbers. Then I'll hold it. You'll command from the wall. You're the only one they'll follow. All of them. Watch and wildlings alike. You can't do that from inside a tunnel. Barristan. This isn't a discussion, Jon. I've spent my entire life standing between kings and the things that would kill them. This is the same. 1 more door. 1 more corridor. 1 more man willing to hold it. Barristan's voice was quiet and absolutely final. I'll hold the tunnel. Jon wanted to argue. He wanted to pull rank, to order Barristan to the rear, to do whatever he had to do to keep the old knight out of the most dangerous position in the entire defense. But he looked at Barristan and saw the same thing he'd always seen. A man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. A man whose decisions were made in the space between heartbeats and never reconsidered. I'll put 30 men with you, Jon said, his voice rough. 10. Any more and they'll get in each other's way. 20. 12. Final offer. Jon closed his eyes. 12. The best 12 we have. I'll choose them myself. The war council ended, the men filed out to their positions, to their preparations, to the quiet terror of waiting for something that was coming and could not be stopped. The night before the battle, Castle Black was quiet. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of men who were awake and afraid and didn't want anyone to hear. Jon walked the castle in the dark, checking posts, speaking to sentries, making sure the defenses were ready, and everywhere he went he found the same thing. Men sitting with their backs against walls, staring at nothing, waiting for a dawn that would bring them either death or something worse than death. He found Tormund on the wall, sitting with his back against the parapet, drinking from a horn of fermented goat's milk. "Want some?" Tormund offered. Jon sat beside him and drank. It tasted like something that had died in a boot, but it was warm. "I've fought bears," Tormund said, staring north. "Shadowcats, other wildlings. Once a man who claimed to be a giant and was close enough. I've fought in blizzards and on frozen rivers and once on a cliff face 300 feet above a canyon." He took the horn back. "I've never been afraid before a fight. Not like this." "Fear is not weakness," Jon said. "Fear is information." Tormund looked at him. "Who told you that?" "Barristan, the first time he put a real sword in my hand." "Sounds like something the old man would say." Tormund drank again. "He's going to die in that tunnel. You know." Jon said nothing. "He knows it. You know it. Everyone who saw him volunteer knows it. The only question is how many he takes with him before he goes." Tormund handed him the horn. "He's not doing it because he wants to die. He's doing it because he's the only one who can hold it long enough. And he's right. I've watched him fight. That old man in a narrow corridor is worth every warrior I've ever known. I know. Then let him do it. Don't cheapen it by trying to save him." Jon drank. The fermented milk burned his throat and settled in his stomach like a coal. "He taught me everything," Jon said quietly. "I know. That's why he's doing it." Tormund took the horn back and stood, towering over Jon in the darkness. "Get some sleep, Snow, or don't. But stop walking the castle like a ghost. You're scaring the men." Jon found Sam in the library, surrounded by books he'd pulled from the shelves. Sam was reading by candlelight, his lips moving, making notes on a scrap of parchment. "What are you looking for?" Jon asked. "Anything, everything. There has to be something in these books about how the first men defeated the White Walkers the first time. The long night. The battle for the dawn. Something we can use. Have you found anything? Legends, song stories that contradict each other." Sam looked up, and his eyes were red from strain and worry. "But there's one thing they all agree on. The walkers were beaten, not destroyed. They were pushed back beyond the wall. The wall was built to keep them there. They've been waiting ever since." "Waiting for what?" "I don't know. The stories don't say. Maybe they were waiting for the wall to weaken. Maybe for the watch to weaken. Maybe for something else entirely." Sam set down his book. "Jon, if we survive tomorrow, someone needs to figure out why they came back. Not just how to fight them. Why? That someone is you, Sam. I was afraid you'd say that." Jon put his hand on Sam's shoulder. "Survive tomorrow. Then, figure out why. In that order." He found Barristan last. Jon stayed behind in the empty hall, staring at the fire, and Barristan stayed with him. "The 6-strike drill," Barristan said. Jon looked up. "You remember it. I could do it in my sleep. When the time comes, and it will come, when you're facing something that's faster and stronger than anything you've ever fought, you come back to the drill. Don't think. Don't improvise. Let the muscle do the work. 9 years of training is in your hands, Jon. Trust them." "I will." Barristan stood. He crossed to where Jon sat and looked down at him, and Jon saw the old knight's face clearly in the firelight. The lines, the scars, the white stubble on his jaw, the blue eyes that had watched him grow from a boy into a man. The face of the truest father he had ever known. "I'm proud of you," Barristan said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens, I am proud of what you've become. Don't talk like that. I'll talk however I please. I'm 67 years old, and I've earned the right." Barristan reached into his pack and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He held it out to Jon. "Here, I've been carrying this since King's Landing." Jon unwrapped it. It was a brooch, silver, worked in the shape of a direwolf's head. Simple, elegant, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't shout but whispered. "I had a silversmith make it after the melee," Barristan said. "After you fought in the yard and half the court saw you move. I was going to give it to you at the tourney feast, but..." He shrugged. "Things went wrong. It's beautiful. It's yours. A wolf's head for a wolf's son." Barristan paused. "And a dragon's son." "Both." Jon closed his hand around the brooch and felt the edges of the direwolf press into his palm. Barristan put his hand on Jon's head, briefly, the way he used to when Jon was a boy. "Sleep, Jon. Tomorrow we prepare. The day after, we fight." The dead came on the third day. Jon was on the wall when the horns sounded. 3 blasts. The signal for White Walkers. A sound that had not been heard at Castle Black in living memory. A sound that belonged to the age of heroes and the long night and stories told to frighten children. 3 long blasts echoing off the ice, and every man at Castle Black stopped what he was doing and looked north. Jon drew Longclaw. The Valyrian steel was warm in his hand despite the cold, and he felt the weight of it settle into his grip like an extension of his arm. Beside him, the archers knocked their first arrows. Below, the shield wall formed in the courtyard, hundreds of men locking together with the mechanical precision of Barristan's drilling. Jon took one breath. Then, he spoke, and his voice carried down to every man on the wall and every man below it. "They're here," Jon said. "The dead. The army that drove 100,000 free folk south. The army that killed your Lord Commander and 50 of your brothers. They're here, and they want through this wall, and they're not going to get through." He looked down at the courtyard. Wildlings and Watch and Northerners, standing together, shields locked, weapons ready. Men and women who had hated each other a month ago, who had tried to kill each other a fortnight before that. Standing shoulder to shoulder, because a single old knight had spent 2 weeks teaching them that the man beside you was the only thing between you and death. Hold your positions. Trust the man next to you. When the fire burns out, hold. When the barricades break, hold. When you're tired and afraid and you think you can't take another step, hold. Because the dead don't get tired. The dead don't get afraid. The dead just keep coming. And the only thing that stops them is us. Silence. Then Tormund's voice rose from the courtyard, enormous and unstoppable. You heard the man. Hold the bloody line. A roar went up. Worldling and Crow and Northerner, unified in the only way that mattered. In the tunnel, Barristan and his 12 took their positions. The old knight had chosen well. 6 Watch brothers, 4 Wildlings, and 2 of Jon's Northerners. The best fighters at Castle Black, selected not for loyalty or origin, but for the single quality that mattered in a 10-foot wide tunnel, the ability to hold ground. Barristan had tested each of them personally, putting them through a drill he'd designed specifically for close quarters fighting. And the 12 who could hold a corridor against twice their number were the 12 who stood with him now. Barristan drew his sword and set the dragonglass dagger at his hip, where he could reach it in a single motion. He looked at his 12 men and nodded. "Nothing gets through," he said. "That's the whole plan. Nothing gets through." Jon looked down from the wall's edge and found Barristan at the tunnel entrance, 70 stories below. The old knight looked up, and even at that distance, Jon could see his eyes. Blue and steady and ready. They came with the dawn, which was wrong. The dead were supposed to come at night, in the dark, where the cold was strongest and the fear was deepest. But they came with the dawn. A line of movement on the northern horizon that grew and spread and filled the world from east to west, and when the sun rose behind the wall, it rose on an army that made every force Jon had ever seen look like a child's game. The Whites came first, thousands upon thousands of them, a tide of rotting flesh and rusted weapons and burning blue eyes. Walking south with the steady, mechanical pace of things that had forgotten what it meant to hurry. They made no sound, no war cries, no drums, no horns. just the crunch of frozen feet on frozen ground, a rhythm like a heartbeat, relentless and absolute. Behind the Whites, the White Walkers. Jon saw them from the top of the wall, riding dead horses draped in frost. They were tall, taller than men, with skin like cracked ice and eyes that blazed a blue so deep it was almost violet. They carried weapons of crystallized ice, swords and spears that shimmered in the thin sunlight as if they were made of frozen light itself. There were dozens of them. Jon counted and stopped at 30. "Light the trenches," Jon said. The order passed down the wall. Men with torches ran to the oil channels and touched fire to the prepared lines, and the outer trench erupted in a wall of flame that stretched a quarter-mile in either direction. The heat was enormous, reaching even to the top of the wall, and the Whites at the front of the army walked directly into it and burned. They burned by the hundreds. They walked into the fire without hesitation, without fear, without any attempt to avoid the flames, and they burned and collapsed and were trampled by the Whites behind them. The fire consumed them, but it also consumed itself, and within an hour, the first trench was dying, smothered by the sheer mass of bodies that had been poured into it. "Second trench," Jon ordered. The second trench lit, more fire, more burning dead, more of that terrible sweet smell of rotting meat-meeting flame. But the dead kept coming. They walked over their burning brothers, their frozen flesh catching and flaring and going dark, and they came on. "They're using the bodies as bridges," Barristan observed from below, where he stood at the entrance to the tunnel with his 12 chosen fighters. His voice carried through the speaking tubes that connected the wall's top to the base. "The first wave dies to make a path for the second." "I know," Jon said. "The third trench won't hold them either." "I know." "Jon." "I know, Barristan." The third trench burned and died. The dead crossed it on the charred remains of their own army, and then there was nothing between them and the wall but 50 yards of open ground, and the barricades. "Archers," Jon called. "Fire." 500 bows spoke at once from the top of the wall. Dragonglass arrowheads rained down on the army of the dead, and where they struck, Whites fell and did not rise. But 500 arrows into 100,000 Whites was like throwing stones into the sea. The arrows killed dozens, and thousands more stepped over the fallen. The dead reached the barricades. The sharpened stakes slowed them. Whites impaled themselves on the wood and kept reaching, kept clawing, kept trying to push through. Others climbed over their impaled brothers, tearing themselves on the stakes, leaving strips of frozen flesh hanging from the points like banners. A White in the rusted armor of a Night's Watch ranger caught on 3 stakes at once, pinned through chest and shoulders, and it kept reaching forward, its blue eyes locked on the wall, its jaw working in silent repetition of some command only the dead could hear. The barricades held for 30 minutes. Then, the weight of the dead began pushing them back, snapping stakes, collapsing barriers, opening gaps. The first row of barricades folded like paper under the mass of bodies pressing against them, and the second row groaned and tilted. "They're through." A voice screamed from the courtyard. "Hold the line." Jon shouted, "Formation," as we trained. The shield wall formed. Wildlings and Night's Watch standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, dragonglass spears bristling outward like the quills of an enormous porcupine. Barristan's weeks of drilling held. The wall that formed was not perfect, not the disciplined line of trained soldiers, but it was solid. It held. The first Whites hit the wall and were pushed back. The second wave hit, and a man fell. The third wave hit, and 3 men fell, and the gap was filled before the dead could pour through. Jon saw a wildling woman pull a fallen watchbrother back behind the line and take his place in the shield wall without a word. He saw a Then warrior lock his shield against a Night's Watch steward's, the 2 of them holding a section of wall together that neither could have held alone. Barristan's work. All of it, every drill, every correction, every morning in the yard. This was what he had built. Tormund fought like the legend he was. His greatsword, modified with a dragonglass edge that Barristan had insisted upon, swept through Whites in arcs that cleared space for the men beside him. He roared constantly, a sound that was half battle cry and half laughter, and the wildlings near him fought harder for hearing it. A wight in furs reached for his face, and Tormund headbutted it so hard its skull caved in, then swept it aside with the flat of his blade and stepped forward into the gap it left. Thorn fought too. The Dow commander had positioned himself at the weakest point of the courtyard defense, where the dead pressed hardest, and he held it with a cold efficiency that made Jon think, not for the first time, that Alusa Thorn had always been a soldier and never should have been anything else. Thorn's dragonglass dagger found white after white with mechanical precision, and the men around him held their ground, because Alyssa Thorn did not retreat, and neither would they. Carsey, the wildling woman Barristan had taught to angle her shield, fought beside 2 watch brothers in the eastern section. She killed 7 whites with a dragonglass-tipped spear before a child white got under her guard. She froze. Just for a second, the child's blue eyes staring up at her, the small grey hands reaching, and something in her, some instinct older than warfare, wouldn't let her strike. A watch brother beside her put his blade through the white's skull, and Carsey shook herself and went back to fighting, and neither of them spoke about it afterward. But they were losing. The dead were too many. For every white that fell, 3 more took its place. The shield wall buckled, reformed, buckled again. Men were dragged into the mass of dead and disappeared, and moments later their screams stopped, and their eyes turned blue, and they stood back up on the wrong side. Jon watched it happen to a man he'd trained with on the ride north, watched the life leave his eyes and the blue light replace it. Watched the man's sword turn in his dead hand to point at the brothers he'd been standing beside a moment before. Jon ordered the flaming pitch. Barrels of it rolled off the top of the wall, crashing into the mass of whites below with a sound like thunder. The pitch exploded on impact, spraying fire across the dead, and whites burned by the dozens. But the dead behind them pushed through the fire, their flesh catching and charring, walking through the flames on the bodies of their burning brothers. The walkers, Jon said, scanning the field. Where are the walkers? They were closer now. The battle had drawn them forward, as Mance had predicted. Jon could see them at the edge of the horde, mounted on their dead horses, watching the assault on the wall with the patient intelligence of generals who had never lost a war. They're waiting for the tunnel, Jon realized. They want the gate open. He looked down at the tunnel entrance. Barristan stood there with his 12 men, dragonglass weapons ready, torches burning on either side. The old knight looked up, and across 700 feet of ice and air, their eyes met. Barristan nodded. The dead hit the gate. The outer door was iron and oak, 3 feet thick, and it buckled on the first impact. Not from a battering ram. From the sheer weight of bodies pressing against it, thousands of whites crushing forward, driven by a will that was not their own. The door groaned. The hinges screamed. Ice cracked from the ceiling of the tunnel and fell in sheets. "Here they come," Barristan said. The door broke. The whites poured through the gap like water through a broken dam, and they met Barristan Selmy in the narrow throat of the tunnel, and they died. In the confines of that passage, where only 2 could fight abreast, Barristan's skill was worth 100 men. His sword moved in the precise, economical arcs of a master who had spent 60 years perfecting the geometry of killing. Every cut found its mark. Every step placed him exactly where he needed to be. The tunnel was 10 feet wide, and Barristan held all 10 of them. He fought the way he had always fought. Not with rage, not with desperation, but with the measured, almost meditative focus of a man performing an act he had been born to perform. His feet moved in patterns so deeply grooved into his muscles that his body no longer needed his mind's permission. Parry, step, cut. Parry, step, cut. The rhythm of it was like breathing, like heartbeat, like the tide coming in and going out. He had fought in the throne room of the Red Keep, and on the tawny fields of Harrenhal, and in the burning streets of Duskendale, and this was the same. The same motion, the same precision, the same absolute commitment to standing where he stood until someone moved him or killed him. The whites could not move him. They came at him in twos and threes, crowding the tunnel entrance, stumbling over the fallen, reaching for him with dead hands and rusted weapons. And he met them with a wall of steel that did not bend. His 12 men fought beside him in shifts, 2 at a time, rotating back when their arms tired while Barristan held the center. He never rotated. He never rested. The whites came in an endless stream, and Barristan cut them down in an endless rhythm, and the floor of the tunnel grew slick with the ichor of the dead. On top of the wall, Jon saw the walkers move. 3 of them rode forward through the mass of whites toward the tunnel entrance. They could feel their army being held. They could feel the resistance in the narrow passage, the single point of human defiance that was costing them hundreds of soldiers. And they came forward to break it. "The walkers are moving to the tunnel," Jon said. His voice was calm. Calm the way Barristan had taught him to be calm. The calm of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. "Barristan," Jon said into the speaking tube. "I see them." Barristan's voice came back, breathless but steady. "I see them, Jon. I'm coming down." "No. Hold the wall. Command the battle." "I have this." "You can't fight 3 walkers alone. I don't intend to fight 3. I intend to hold the tunnel until you can get a force to the north face. Go around. Come at them from behind. Use the wall's defenders' stare. Hit the walkers from outside while they're focused on getting through." Jon hesitated for one heartbeat. Then he understood. Barristan wasn't trying to kill the walkers. He was fixing them, pinning them in the tunnel, forcing them to commit to a single point of attack, while Jon maneuvered a strike force to hit them from the rear. It was the same principle Barristan had used at the Whispering Wood, the same principle he'd been teaching Jon for 9 years. Draw the enemy's attention. Hold it. Let the killing blow come from where they're not looking. "You hold that tunnel," Jon said. "I've been holding doors and tunnels and corridors for 60 years, Jon. One more won't kill me." Jon wanted to say something else, something about what Barristan meant to him, about the 9 years and the training and the truth and all of it. But there wasn't time, and Barristan wouldn't have wanted it anyway. The old knight had never been a man for speeches. He was a man for doing. "Hold it," Jon said, and ran. He gathered 30 men from the reserves, the best fighters, the fastest, the ones carrying dragonglass. Tormund, Valathen warrior named Styr, who fought with 2 axes. Ed Tollett, who had no business being in a strike force, but refused to be left behind. Ghost padded at Jon's side, silent and enormous, his white fur streaked with the blood of whites. They descended the wall on the eastern stair, a narrow stone passage that spiraled down through the ice, and emerged at the base on the north side. The army of the dead stretched before them, but the bulk of the force was pushing south toward the gate. The eastern flank was thin. Whites milled in disordered groups, awaiting commands that hadn't come. "Straight through," Jon said. "Stay tight. Don't stop for anything that isn't between you and the walkers." They hit the flank like a spear. The whites on the east were disorganized, milling clusters of dead men awaiting direction that was focused elsewhere. Jon cut through the first group before they could react, Longclaw taking heads and arms with the clean economy of movement that Barristan had drilled into him since childhood. Ghost hit the whites from the left, a white blur of teeth and speed, tearing through dead flesh with the savage efficiency of a predator that did not distinguish between the living and the dead. Tormund's greatsword carved a road of fallen dead, the big wildling roaring with every swing, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle like a war horn. Ed fought beside a Then warrior, the 2 of them covering each other's flanks, fighting together with the wordless coordination of men who had trained side by side and discovered, somewhere between the drills and the exhaustion, that the man beside you mattered more than where he was born. Val put arrows into whites at close range, firing and moving, the way the wildlings had learned to fight things that didn't stop coming. She fired 12 arrows in 30 seconds, and 11 found their marks, and the 12th went through a white's eye socket and out the back of its skull, which was close enough. They lost 6 men breaking through the flank. Jon felt each death as a weight added to a burden he was already struggling to carry. But he kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant standing back up, and standing back up meant everything Barristan had fought for was lost. They broke through and turned west, toward the tunnel entrance, and Jon saw the 3 White Walkers. They were dismounted now, moving toward the tunnel on foot, their ice blades drawn. The dead parted before them like water before stones. They were beautiful, in the way that avalanches are beautiful, in the way that storms over the sea are beautiful, with the terrible, indifferent beauty of things that will kill you without noticing. Take the walkers. Jon screamed. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, everything you have. The first walker turned. Its eyes found Jon across 30 yards of carnage, and its mouth opened, and the sound that came out was not a scream, and not a word, and not anything Jon had ever heard from a living throat. It was the sound of ice breaking in the deep north, the sound of rivers freezing from the bottom up, the sound of cold itself given voice. Jon charged it. The walker's blade met Longclaw with a sound like shattering glass, and sparks flew, cold sparks, blue and white, and Jon felt the impact travel up his arms and into his shoulders. The walker was faster than anything he'd ever fought. Faster than Jaime Lannister, faster than the Hound, faster than the best fighters Barristan had ever set against him in training. But Jon had been trained by Barristan Selmy, the 6-strike drill. He heard it in Barristan's voice, the way he'd heard it every morning for 9 years. High right, low left, reverse, thrust, bind, and cut. Jon's body moved without his mind's permission, the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions taking over, and Longclaw described the pattern in the frozen air. And the walker met the first 5 strikes and could not answer the 6th. Longclaw caught the walker across the chest. Valyrian steel met ancient ice, and the walker exploded. It didn't fall, didn't crumble, didn't die the way men died. It shattered, burst outward in a spray of crystallized ice that hung in the air for a moment like diamond dust before settling to the ground. Around Jon, 30 whites collapsed, dead strings cut by a dead puppeteer. The second walker came at him from the left. It was faster than the first, quicker to adapt, and its ice sword came at Jon in a diagonal slash that would have split him from shoulder to hip if he hadn't been moving already. Lateral footwork. Barristan's voice in his head, clear as the morning it was first spoken. Never let them set their feet. Move before they expect you to move. Make them chase angles they haven't prepared for. Jon pivoted, and the walker's blade hissed past his ear, close enough to frost the stubble on his jaw. He met the return strike with a bind that Barristan had shown him on his 14th name day, a technique the old knight called the door, because you used the enemy's own force to slam them shut. The walker pushed, putting its inhuman strength into the bind, and Jon twisted, the bind and twist, the movement flowing through his wrist and forearm and shoulder like water through a channel, and the walker's sword went wide, pulled offline by its own momentum, and Longclaw found its throat. The walker tried to scream. The sound came out broken, fractured, and then it shattered, the ice exploding outward, and 60 whites collapsed around them like a field of wheat in a sudden wind. Inside the tunnel, Barristan heard the whites around him collapse. Half the dead pressing against his line simply dropped, crumpling to the ground like discarded clothing. The pressure eased. Barristan's 12 men surged forward, pushing the remaining whites back. Then the third walker entered the tunnel. It was larger than the others, taller, older, with armor of ice that covered it from throat to knee. It carried a spear of crystallized ice, and where it walked, frost spread across the tunnel walls in patterns that looked like grasping hands. Barristan's 12 men charged it. 2 died in the first second. The walker's spear moved so fast it seemed to exist in 2 places at once, and the men it struck didn't just die. They froze. Solid, instantly, their bodies turned to pillars of ice where they stood, expressions of courage frozen on their faces forever. Barristan pushed forward. The remaining 10 men of his 12 formed behind him, but the tunnel was too narrow for more than 2 abreast, and Barristan was the point of the spear. He had a dragonglass dagger in his left hand and his steel sword in his right. The dagger could kill this thing. The sword could not. But the sword could block, could parry, could buy the half second he needed to drive the dagger home. The walker saw him and stopped, its blue eyes fixed on Barristan with something that might have been recognition, as if it knew, in whatever cold consciousness it possessed, that this was different, that this man was different. In that frozen moment, standing in a tunnel beneath 700 feet of ice, facing something that had existed since before written history, Barristan Selmy felt nothing but clarity. The pain in his joints was gone. The ache in his sword hand was gone. The shortness of breath, the stiffness, the accumulation of 67 years of living, all of it fell away, stripped clean by the simple perfection of purpose. This tunnel, this enemy, this moment, everything he had ever been had led to this. Barristan attacked. He came in with the 6-strike drill, the same pattern he'd taught Jon, the pattern he'd used 1,000 times in tournaments and battles across the length and breadth of the 7 kingdoms. High right, low left, reverse, thrust, bind and cut. His sword arm remembered what his mind no longer needed to direct. The muscle memory of decades poured through his hand like water through a channel. Clean and undeniable, the walker met every strike. Its ice spear was impossibly quick, moving from parry to thrust with a fluidity that bordered on art, and Barristan realized with a calm that surprised him that this thing had been fighting for 8,000 years and had forgotten more about combat than he would ever learn. He feinted left and drove the dagger at the walker's ribs. The walker caught the dagger on the haft of its spear and twisted, nearly tearing it from Barristan's grip. He held on. His fingers burned with cold where the spear had touched the dagger's blade, and the cold spread down his hand and into his wrist like frost creeping across glass. Behind him, his men fought the whites that were still pressing through the tunnel's entrance. He could hear them dying. The wet sound of ice meeting flesh, the grunt of men going down, the silence that followed. 5 of his 12 were dead now. 6. Barristan adjusted. He stopped trying to match the walker's speed and started fighting angles. The tunnel was his ally. The walker was tall, and the tunnel ceiling forced it to hunch, forced it to shorten its spear thrusts. Barristan used the walls, bouncing off the ice, using the confined space to create angles that the walker's longer weapon couldn't follow. It was the finest swordsmanship of his life. 67 years of training and warfare and study compressed into a space 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, against an opponent that was older than the kingdom he'd served. He fought with everything he had, every technique, every trick, every lesson he'd ever learned or taught. But Barristan had one thing the walker did not. He had something to lose. He had someone to protect. Behind him, beyond the wall, a boy he'd trained for 9 years was fighting for the living. And as long as Barristan Selmy stood in this tunnel, nothing was getting through it. He pressed the attack. His sword arm screamed with every strike, the cold from the walker's weapon spreading up his blade and into the steel and into his hand like poison. His left knee buckled, and he caught himself and kept fighting. His breath came in gasps that froze before they left his lips. 7 of his 12 were dead. 8. He was alone. The last of his men had fallen somewhere behind him, and it was just Barristan and the walker and the whites pressing through the tunnel entrance, and he was 67 years old and dying on his feet, and it didn't matter, because the tunnel was 10 feet wide, and he filled every inch of it. The walker's spear caught him in the side. The pain was like nothing he'd ever felt. Not pain. Exactly, absence. The spear drove through his armor and into his ribs, and everything around the wound went cold, and then went numb, and then went dark. Barristan felt his left leg stop working. He felt his breath turn shallow and wrong. He felt the cold enter his lungs and spread outward. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen 1,000 wounds, that this one was mortal. But his sword arm still moved. He thought of Jon, 7 years old, holding a wooden sword too heavy for his small hands, looking up at Barristan with eyes that held more determination than any tournament champion. He thought of the promise he'd made to Ned Stark on the walls of Winterfell. Bring him home alive. He thought of Rhaegar, the prince he'd failed to save, and the son he had not failed. He drove the dragonglass dagger upward, under the walker's arm, into the gap between its ice armor, and felt it sink into something that was not flesh and not ice, but something older than both. The walker screamed. That same sound, ice breaking, rivers freezing, and it shattered. Barristan fell. The remaining whites in the tunnel collapsed. The tunnel went quiet. Outside, Jon felt the third walker die, felt the wave of whites around him drop, and turned toward the tunnel entrance. Barristan. He ran. Through the fallen dead, over the barricades, through the shattered gate, into the tunnel. The air inside was cold beyond anything he'd felt, a cold that pressed against his chest and made breathing feel like drowning. The floor was covered with the remains of whites and the bodies of men who had died holding it. Barristan was on the ground. He was leaning against the tunnel wall, his sword still in his right hand, the shattered remains of the dragonglass dagger in his left. The wound in his side was wrong. Not bleeding. Not really. The flesh around the spear wound was grey and crystallized, frost spreading outward from it in slow, deliberate patterns. Jon dropped to his knees beside him. "The walker?" Barristan asked. His voice was quiet but clear, and Jon felt a surge of desperate hope that vanished as quickly as it came when he saw the wound. "Dead, all three. I killed 2 on the north face. The 6th strike drill? Yes." Barristan's mouth twitched. "On another man, in another moment, it might have been a smile. Good, I taught you well. Barristan, let me get you to the—" "No." The word was gentle but final. "The wound is cold, Jon. I can feel it spreading. This isn't something a maester can stitch." Jon looked at the wound and knew he was right. The frost had reached Barristan's hip. His left hand had stopped moving. The cold was spreading through him the way fire spreads through paper, and there was nothing in the world that could stop it. The ice that had killed the walker was killing the man who had destroyed it, a final act of malice from something that was not alive enough to feel malice, but old enough to have learned it. "Don't," Jon said. His voice broke on the word. "Don't do this. I didn't plan on it. But some things aren't about planning." Barristan's eyes were still blue, still clear, still the eyes of a knight who had never looked away from anything in 67 years. The tunnel held. Jon. The wall held. "I kept my promise." "What promise?" "Both of them. I promised your father I'd bring you home alive. And I promised myself I'd stand between the darkness and the people who couldn't stand for themselves." He paused, and his breath hitched, and the frost crept another inch up his side. "A knight is a man who keeps his promises, Jon, even the ones that cost him everything." "You told me that once," Jon whispered. "In Winterfell. I was 12. I asked you what a knight was, and you said, 'A man who stands between the darkness and the people who cannot stand for themselves.'" Barristan's voice was fading, growing thinner, as if the cold was stealing it the way it was stealing everything else. "I meant it then. I mean it now. I've always meant it." Jon took Barristan's hand. It was cold, but the grip was still there, weakened but present. The hand that had held a sword for 60 years and a boy's shoulder for 9. Jon held it the way he'd held that hand the first time Barristan had led him across the yard at Winterfell. A boy of 7 following the greatest knight in the world because the knight had seen something in him that no one else had bothered to look for. "You were the finest knight who ever lived," Jon said. "I was a man who tried." Barristan's eyes found Jon's and held them. The blue was fading, the frost reaching higher, but the clarity remained. The focus, the absolute, unwavering attention of a man who had spent his life paying attention and would not stop now. "You are the finest thing I ever made, Jon Snow. Not the sword, not the warrior, the man. You are the finest thing I ever made, and I am. I am so proud." His grip loosened. His eyes didn't close. They stayed open, blue and clear, fixed on Jon's face. But the light behind them was gone, the way a candle goes out, not all at once, but in stages, the flame shrinking and wavering, and finally, quietly, ceasing to be. Barristan Selmy died in the tunnel beneath the wall, with his sword in his hand and his student at his side. Jon stayed. He stayed in the tunnel with Barristan's body while the battle raged above him. He held the old knight's hand and felt the cold creep through it and felt nothing at all. The way he'd felt nothing when his father died on the steps of the Sept of Baelor. The numbness that wasn't absence of feeling, but feeling so enormous, it overwhelmed the capacity to process it. The tunnel was quiet now. The whites that had poured through were still, collapsed when the walkers shattered, lying in heaps on the frozen floor. The torches still burned on either side of the tunnel entrance, casting long shadows across the dead and the one man among them who had earned the right to rest. Jon looked at Barristan's face and tried to memorize it. The way the lines fell around his eyes. The scar on his left cheek from a tournament at Storm's End, decades before Jon was born. The stubble on his jaw, white as the cloak he'd worn for most of his life. He was smiling. Not the visible kind, not a curve of the lips, but something in the set of his face that suggested satisfaction. The expression of a man who had done what he set out to do and was content with the price. Jon thought about the yard at Winterfell, the smell of cold air and wood shavings and horse sweat, the sound of practice swords cracking together, the feel of Barristan's hand on his shoulder, adjusting his stance, correcting his footwork, building him piece by piece into something that could survive this moment. 9 years. 9 years of mornings and evenings and lessons and corrections, and the quiet, steady presence of a man who had chosen to stay when every obligation said he should leave. 9 years of becoming. And now the man who had done the building was gone, and the building stood alone. Ghost found him there. The direwolf padded through the tunnel's carnage and lay down beside Jon and pressed his warm body against Jon's knee, and Jon buried his hand in the wolf's fur and gripped it until his knuckles whitened. Jon, Ed Tollett stood at the tunnel entrance, silhouetted against the grey light of morning. The walkers are breaking. The whites are falling all along the line. Whatever you did out there, it's working. The whole army is collapsing. Jon looked up. His face was dry. He had not cried. He didn't know if he would. How many did we lose? He asked. I don't have numbers yet. A lot. And the walkers? The 3 you and Sir Barristan killed seem to have commanded most of the force. The other walkers are retreating north, taking what whites they have left and running. Running? Retreating, moving fast. Whatever they are, they know when they've lost. Jon looked back at Barristan. The frost had stopped spreading. In death, the cold had claimed what it wanted and moved on. Get me a cloak, Jon said. A white one, if we have it. They didn't have a white cloak. The Night's Watch wore black, and the Wildlings wore brown. And no one at the end of the world kept white fabric in reserve. But Ed found a cloak of pale grey, almost white, that had belonged to one of the Watch's stores, and Jon draped it over Barristan's body and carried him out of the tunnel himself. He carried him through the gate, past the broken barricades, past the charred remains of the fire trenches, into the courtyard of Castle Black, where the survivors stood in the pale morning light and watched their Lord Commander carry the body of the greatest knight who ever lived. Jon laid Barristan on a table in the center of the courtyard. He straightened the old knight's armor. He closed his eyes. He placed the sword on his chest, the way they lay swords on the chests of dead kings. Because Barristan Selmy had been more than a king. He had been a teacher and a father and a friend, and the realm would not see his like again. Tormund approached. The big wildling's face was cut and bruised, his armor slashed in a dozen places. But he was alive. Who was he? Tormund asked. Not who was he the way you ask about a stranger. Who was he the way you ask about someone whose death has changed the shape of the world? He was Barristan Selmy, Jon said. He was the greatest swordsman in the 7 kingdoms. He trained me from the time I was 7 years old. He held that tunnel alone at the end. I know. No, you don't. I saw it from the wall. His men were down, all of them, and he was fighting by himself. A walker and 30 whites in a space 10 feet wide. He held it for 4 minutes alone, Jon. 4 minutes. No one does that. He did. Tormund put his hand on Jon's shoulder. The wildling's grip was crushing, and Jon was grateful for it. We'll sing songs about him, Tormund said. Beyond the wall, songs are how we remember. We'll sing about the old knight who held the tunnel. Jon nodded. He couldn't speak. Mance came next. The king beyond the wall stood before Barristan's body for a long time, his weathered face unreadable. I saw a lot of men die today, Mance said. Good men, brave men, men who deserved better than this frozen end. But I've never seen anyone fight like that. He was alone, in there, at the end, 10 feet of tunnel and one old man against an army. Mance looked at Jon. Your people call him Barristan the Bold. Beyond the wall, we'd have called him something simpler. We'd have called him the Door. Val came. She touched Barristan's hand, the hand that had held a sword for 60 years, and she held it for a moment before letting go. He taught me how to angle a shield, she said quietly, one afternoon, in the yard. I told him I'd been fighting since I was 6 and didn't need a southerner to teach me how to hold a piece of wood. He said, "Then show me." I showed him. He adjusted my grip by ½ inch. That ½ inch saved my life today. Sam came. He wept openly, making no effort to hide it, and Jon loved him for it. Sam had known Barristan for barely a month, but Sam understood something that harder men missed. That grief was not weakness. That tears were not a failure of courage, but an expression of it. That being willing to feel the weight of a death was braver, in its way, than refusing to feel anything at all. Thorne came last. He stood at attention, rigid and silent, and gave a salute that Jon suspected was the most genuine gesture the man had ever made. He held it for 10 seconds. Then he lowered his hand, turned, and walked away without speaking. They built the pyre at sunset. Jon built it himself, stacking the timber in the pattern Barristan had taught him for campaign fires. Small wood at the base, larger logs above, a framework that would catch quickly and burn hot enough to return a man to the elements. He placed Barristan's body on top, still wrapped in the pale grey cloak, his sword on his chest. The entire garrison of Castle Black gathered around the pyre. Night's Watch, wildlings, northern soldiers. 300 survivors of a battle that should have killed them all, standing in a circle around one old knight who had held the door. Jon took a torch. He stood before the pyre and looked at the face of the man who had made him. The lines, the scars, the jaw that had been set in determination for 67 years. The face of a knight, the face of a father. Sir Barristan Selmy, Jon said. His voice carried across the courtyard, steady and clear and final. Knight of the Kingsguard, shield of the realm, teacher and protector and friend. He came to Winterfell to deliver a hostage and stayed 9 years to build a man. He stood between the darkness and the people who could not stand for themselves. He held the tunnel when no one else could. He kept every promise he ever made. Jon touched the torch to the timber, and now his watch is ended. The fire caught. The pyre blazed. The heat drove the watchers back, but Jon stood close enough to feel the flames on his face, and watched the fire claim the finest man he'd ever known. Mance Rayder, king beyond the wall, said something in the old tongue. The wildlings around him bowed their heads. Maester Aemon, blind and ancient, recited words from a prayer so old that no one recognized the language. Ghost sat beside Jon and howled, a single long note that rose above the fire and the wall and the wind, and echoed off the ice, and came back changed, as if the wall itself were mourning. The pyre burned through the night. Jon stood watch. He stood alone, as he had stood alone at Ned Stark's death, as he would stand alone at many deaths to come. The fire shrank from a blaze to a glow to embers, and when the dawn came, grey and cold and merciless, there was nothing left but ash and the sword, which had survived the fire the way Valyrian steel survived everything. Jon picked the sword from the ashes. It was warm in his hand. He cleaned it carefully, the way Barristan had taught him. Oil on a cloth, slow strokes, the blade held at an angle. The ritual of maintenance, the knight's meditation, the thing you did when everything else was chaos because the sword, at least, could be made right. He heard Barristan's voice as he worked. Not memory, not imagination, something closer to presence. The voice of a teacher who had given his student everything, including the ability to carry on without him. Take care of the blade, Jon. The blade is the last thing between you and whatever wants to kill you. Respect it. Maintain it. And when you draw it meaning it. Jon had drawn it meaning it every time. That was Barristan's gift. Not the technique, not the footwork, not the six-strike drill or the bind and twist or the lateral movement. Those were skills. The gift was something deeper. The gift was the knowledge that a sword was not a weapon. A sword was a promise. A promise to stand, to fight, to protect, to hold the line when every instinct said to run. Barristan had kept that promise for 67 years. Now it was Jon's to keep. He sheathed the sword beside Longclaw and went to assess the damage. The wall had held. The gate was destroyed, but the tunnel itself was intact, and the ice above it showed no sign of fracture. The fire trenches were burned out, the barricades shattered, but these could be rebuilt. The dead had lost thousands, tens of thousands, and the surviving walkers had retreated north with what remained. It was not a victory. Not yet. The Night King was still out there, somewhere in the far north, and the army of the dead, though diminished, was not destroyed. But the wall stood, and the living had fought together, wildlings and watch and northerners side by side, and they had held. How many did we lose? Jon asked Ed. Ed had the numbers. 62 Watch brothers dead. 43 of Jon's northern soldiers. Over 300 wildlings. 408 people who had been alive at dawn yesterday and were ash and memory now. And the dead? Impossible to count. Thousands. Tens of thousands when you include the ones that fell when the walkers shattered. The field north of the wall is covered with them. Just lying there. Still, burn them, Jon said. All of them. Every body on that field. I don't want a single corpse left when the sun goes down. It took 2 days to burn the dead. The field north of the wall became a crematorium, smoke rising in columns that could be seen for miles, and the air turned thick and sweet and terrible. Jon worked with the burning crews. He dragged bodies and stacked timber and held a torch until his arm shook, and when men tried to relieve him, he refused, because the work was penance and prayer, and the only thing keeping his mind from the shape of a man in a tunnel, holding a door that no one else could hold. Sam found him on the 3rd day after the battle, sitting alone in the library, staring at a map of the north. There are more of them, Jon said without looking up. The walkers that retreated. They'll rebuild. It might take years, decades, but they'll come again. I know, Sam said. We need more dragonglass. We need Valyrian steel. We need alliances with every kingdom south of the neck. We need... Jon stopped. We need everything we don't have. We have the wall. We have the wildlings. We have you. That's not enough. It was enough 3 days ago. Jon looked at Sam. The round man looked back steadily, and Jon was struck, not for the first time, by how much courage could live in such an unassuming frame. Barristan would tell you to rest, Sam said gently. He would tell you that the battle is over, and the next one hasn't started, and the time between is for breathing. You didn't know him. I watched him train men for 2 weeks. I watched him hold a tunnel against the dead. I think I knew him well enough. Sam sat down across from Jon. He was the best of us, Jon, but he left something behind. He left you. Jon put his head in his hands. For a long time, he stayed like that, and Sam sat with him and said nothing, because some silences were gifts. When Jon raised his head, his eyes were red but dry. I need to tell you something, Jon said. Something Barristan told me before the battle. He told Sam. All of it. Rhaegar and Lyanna and the Tower of Joy and the promise Ned Stark made to his dying sister. Sam listened without interruption, his round face shifting from confusion to shock to a slow, dawning comprehension. You're Aegon Targaryen, Sam said. I'm Jon Snow. You're both. Sam stood and began pacing, which was something he did when his mind was moving faster than his mouth. Jon, this changes... Do you understand what this means? You're the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. Not Joffrey, not Tommen, not any Lannister or Baratheon. You. I don't want the throne. That's not the point. The point is that you have a claim, a real claim, stronger than anyone alive. And that claim is leverage. You don't have to sit on the throne to use it. You can use it to demand help, to demand that the kingdoms send armies north, send dragonglass, send everything we need to fight this war. Jon stared at him. He hadn't considered that. The name, the blood, the legacy of Rhaegar Targaryen, not as a burden, but as a weapon. Not a crown to wear, but a card to play. That's remarkably cynical for you, Sam. I learned cynicism from watching honorable men die for being too honest. Sam sat back down. Your father, your real father, Ned Stark, he kept your secret to protect you. Now the secret can protect everyone else. Not yet, Jon said. The time isn't right. But soon. You sound like Barristan. Jon almost smiled. Almost send ravens, Jon said. To Winterfell, to Riverrun, to every lord and lady in the Seven Kingdoms. Tell them what happened here. Tell them what's coming. Tell them the wall held once, but it won't hold forever without help. What about the Iron Throne? The Iron Throne can burn for all I care. Send the ravens to the people, not the crown. And your name, your real name. Jon thought about it. About Rhaegar and Lyanna and Ned and Barristan. About the truth and what it cost and what it bought. Keep it, Jon said. For now. But write it down, Sam. Write everything down. The truth about who I am, what Barristan told me, all of it. Put it somewhere safe. Because if I die, someone needs to know. Sam nodded. I'll write it. I'll keep it. He paused at the door. You know, the last thing Maester Aemon said to me before the battle was, a Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing. I thought he was talking about himself. He left Jon alone in the library. Jon sat in the library and looked at the map. The north stretched above him like an open wound, white and vast and full of things that wanted to kill everything that breathed. South of him, kingdoms squabbled over a chair made of swords while the real war waited in the ice. He wrote to Robb. A long letter, the first long letter he'd ever written to his brother, telling him about the battle and the dead and the wall. He did not tell him about Rhaegar. Not yet. But he told him about Barristan, about the tunnel, about the sacrifice, about the man who had come to Winterfell to deliver a hostage and stayed to build a knight. He was the best man I ever knew, Jon wrote. Better than I deserved. Better than any of us deserved. If the wall still stands, it stands because of him. He sealed the letter and gave it to a raven and watched the black bird disappear into a grey sky. He was Aegon Targaryen. He was Jon Snow. He was the son of a prince and a wolf girl and the student of the greatest knight who ever lived. He was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and champion of the North and the man who had let 90,000 wildlings through the wall. He was all of these things, and none of them, because in the end, titles were words, and words didn't stop the dead. What stopped the dead was fire, and dragonglass, and Valyrian steel, and men willing to stand in a tunnel when everything sane said to run. Jon stood. He buckled on Longclaw and Barristan's sword, one on each hip, and the weight of them was balanced and right. He climbed the wall. It took him 40 minutes, up the winding stairs of ice, past the murder holes and arrow slits, past the places where the dead had tried to climb and left claw marks in the frozen surface. He climbed until his legs burned and his lungs ached, and the world below him shrank to a map. At the top, he stood alone. The wind blew from the north, cold and clean and empty. The haunted forest stretched to the horizon, dark under a pale sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees and the mountains and the endless fields of snow, the Night King waited. Patient, ancient, certain that time was on his side, because time was always on the side of the dead. Jon looked north, and he felt the cold, and he did not flinch. He had been taught by Barristan Selmy. He had been raised by Ned Stark. He had been born of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, fire and ice, in a tower surrounded by blood and roses. He He had fought the dead and held the wall and lost the man who mattered most. He would fight again. He would hold again. He would lose again. Because that was what war did. It took things, beloved things, irreplaceable things, and left you standing in the ashes with a sword in your hand and a choice to make. Barristan had made his choice in a tunnel beneath the wall. Ned had made his choice on the steps of a sept. Rhaegar had made his choice on the banks of the Trident. 3 men, 3 choices, 3 prices, paid in full. Now it was Jon's turn. He drew long claw and held it up to the pale northern light. The Valyrian steel caught the sun and threw it back, a flash of silver in the grey. Then he drew Barristan's sword with his left hand and held them both, crossed before him. 2 blades that had ended wars and begun legends. The wind picked up from the north, carrying the smell of snow and pine and the distant, fading scent of burning dead. The haunted forest was still. The dead had retreated beyond its borders, drawn back to whatever desolate stronghold the Night King called home. They would regroup. They would rebuild. And they would come again, because the dead had one advantage that no strategy could counter. They had time. But so did the living. The wall stood. The gate could be rebuilt. The trenches could be dug again, deeper this time, wider. The dragonglass could be mined and shaped into weapons by the thousands, and the people who stood on this side of the wall, the watchers in the night, the free folk, the northerners and southerners, and every living soul who drew breath in a world that the dead wanted to end, they could learn to fight together. They had already proven that. In one terrible, glorious, devastating battle, they had proven that. Barristan had given them that. His last gift, an army built from enemies, forged in the cold, held together by training and trust and the simple, stubborn refusal to die without fighting. Far below, a raven left Castle Black, flying south. Then another. Then a dozen more, black shapes against a white sky, carrying words to a world that wasn't ready to hear them. The dead are real. The wall held. Send help. Jon Snow stood on the wall. He stood alone. But he stood,